I was already living in the after when I unfolded the quilt. The guest bedroom was quiet in that way that only borrowed rooms ever are. No history of my own in the walls, no familiar creaks, just the polite silence of a space that expected me to leave. The bedspread beneath the quilt was hotel white, tucked tight by someone else's hands, and for a moment I hesitated before laying it down, as if I were afraid the quilt might stain the room with memory. It smelled faintly of cedar and something softer underneath, like old cotton warmed by years of being held. My mother's hands came to me before her face did. I remembered how they trembled when she gave it to me, how she pressed the bundle into my arms as if it weighed more than cloth should. Everyone else was busy that day, counting envelopes, lifting boxes, admiring deeds and jewelry. I had been handed a square of patience and told it was love. I smoothed the quilt out carefully, palm by palm, following the stitching the way some people trace scars. Each square had its own fabric, its own quiet personality. Florals faded into near pastels, sturdy denim cut from someone's old jeans, a fragment of lace that must have come from a dress I no longer owned. It was meticulous work. No one could accuse my mother of being careless. That had never been her crime. Back then, I smiled. I always smiled. I thanked her, kissed her cheek, told her it was beautiful. Someone laughed softly behind me, one of my sisters, I think, and said, "That's so you." Sentimental, easy to please, low maintenance. I wore those words the way other women wear jewelry, not realizing they were meant to mark me. Standing alone in that guest room years later, I realized how small the quilt actually was. Big enough to cover a single body, not big enough to share. I wondered if that had been intentional. The window beside the bed looked out onto a neighbor's fence, close enough that I could see the grain of the wood, the small splits where weather had worried at it. Late afternoon light slipped through the blinds in thin stripes, turning the quilt into a map of shadow and warmth. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the fabric pool over my knees. It felt heavier than it should have, but I told myself that was memory talking. I had avoided touching it for years. It stayed folded in closets, carried from house to house like an obligation I didn't know how to set down. I never gave it away. I never even lent it out. My mother's voice lived inside it, gentle but unyielding. "Promise me you'll keep it. Don't ever let it leave you." She said it the way some people say be careful or call me when you get there. Casual, reasonable, final. At the time, I nodded, because that was what I did when she spoke. I didn't ask why. I never asked why. Asking implied entitlement, and I had learned early that curiosity could be mistaken for greed. The quilt had been given at a gathering that pretended to be about celebration. We were all home, every sibling, every spouse, even the grandchildren who didn't yet understand the choreography of family gatherings. There were folding chairs, paper plates, too much food laid out like proof of abundance. My mother stood at the center of it all, directing traffic, smiling tightly, performing generosity. She handed out gifts the way a teacher returns graded papers, calling names, pausing for effect, watching reactions. Envelopes thick with cash, a set of keys, a folder with legal papers inside. Each gift came with a story attached, a justification spoken aloud so no one would mistake the logic. "You've always been so responsible. You need stability. This will help your children." When my turn came, the room quieted in that uncomfortable way it does when people expect something minor and don't want to be seen reacting to it. My mother held out the quilt, folded neatly, edges aligned. "I made this for you," she said. "You always appreciate things like this." Things like this, handmade, unprofitable, quiet. I felt heat rise to my face as I took it from her. It wasn't that I didn't like it. It was that I understood the exchange rate immediately. I understood where I stood in the accounting of her love. The quilt was effort, yes, but it was effort spent on something that could not be converted into independence. Later, when the noise picked back up and people moved on to dessert, my aunt leaned over and whispered, "You're lucky. That's priceless." I nodded again, because that is what you do when someone mistakes consolation for wisdom. In the guest room now, years removed from that afternoon, the memory still made my throat tighten. I folded the quilt in half, then quarters, checking the seams the way my mother had taught me when I was young. She'd sit me at the kitchen table with scraps and show me how to keep my stitches small, even. "Strong things look delicate," she'd say. "That's how they last." I believed her. The quilt had held up remarkably well. No loose threads, no obvious wear. It had been made to endure, like me. I pressed down along one seam and felt resistance. Not a tear, not weakness, but something firm beneath the padding. I frowned, shifted my hand, pressed again. There it was. A stiffness that didn't belong. For a moment, I pulled my hand back as if the quilt had surprised me. My heart beat faster, ridiculous and loud in the quiet room. I told myself it was nothing. An old fold. A patch sewn too tightly. But my fingers had learned long ago the difference between fabric and what lies beneath it. I stood and lifted the quilt fully onto the bed, smoothing it again, more slowly this time. I followed the seam with my fingertips until I found the place where the texture changed. It was subtle, but once you noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. Something rectangular, something deliberate. I laughed softly to myself, a reflex born of discomfort. "You're being dramatic," I said aloud, because no one was there to contradict me. That, too, was familiar. The room seemed to hold its breath as I fetched the small sewing kit from my bag. The same one I carried everywhere, habit ingrained from years of being the person who fixed things quietly. I sat back down, needle poised, hesitating. The quilt rested across my lap, warm despite the cool room, like it was aware of me in a way people never quite had been. I thought of my mother's eyes the day she gave it to me. How they followed me as I walked away, how she called after me once more, just to say, "Promise." I slid the needle under the first stitch and began to pull. That day comes back to me, now with the clarity of a bruise pressed too often. At the time, I thought it was just another family gathering. Loud, busy, faintly exhausting in the way gatherings always were for me. I arrived early, like I always did, arms full of dishes I'd cooked the night before, hair pinned back so it wouldn't fall into my face while I helped. My mother was already moving through the house with purpose, her voice sharp and efficient, assigning tasks that sounded like favors but landed like expectations. "You're so good at this," she told me, handing me a stack of plates. "I don't know what I'd do without you." It sounded like love. It always did. The living room had been rearranged to make space, chairs pulled from bedrooms, a folding table set up near the wall, gifts stacked neatly in one corner like an altar. Everyone else drifted in slowly, carrying themselves lightly, as if the house belonged to them in a way it never quite belonged to me. My sisters kissed cheeks and complained about traffic. My brothers joked loudly, already at ease. Their hands were empty. When my mother clapped her hands to get our attention, I was standing near the kitchen doorway, wiping my palms on a towel. I remember thinking I should sit down, then deciding it didn't matter. It never did. She started with my oldest sister, an envelope. Thick. My sister laughed, half surprised, half expecting it, and hugged my mother with the easy entitlement of someone who had always been certain of her place. There were comments from the room, how lucky, how wonderful, how deserved. My mother nodded along, pleased. Then my brother, keys this time. He held them up, grinning, already imagining what they unlocked. A car, a property, something solid. My mother explained how it would help him get ahead, how she wanted him to have security. I watched the way his shoulders straightened, the way his voice grew louder as he thanked her. Each gift came with a narrative, spoken clearly enough for everyone to hear. Responsibility rewarded. Potential invested in. Futures protected. By the time she called my name, I felt oddly detached, as if I were watching from somewhere above the room. She handed me the quilt with both hands, careful, almost solemn. "I made this for you," she said again. "You understand how much work goes into something like this." I did understand. I understood too well. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long. Long enough for someone to clear their throat. Long enough for the air to shift. I smiled because the alternative would have been to cry, and crying would have made everyone uncomfortable. "Oh, wow," I said. "It's beautiful." It was the right thing to say. I could tell by the way my mother relaxed, by the way the room exhaled and moved on. No one wanted to sit in that pause. No one wanted to acknowledge the difference between effort and equity. Later, as people milled around, I overheard fragments of conversation that stuck like burrs. She'll appreciate it more. She doesn't need much. You know how she is. Each sentence framed as kindness, each one shrinking me a little further. My aunt found me in the kitchen, refilling drinks. "You're such a good sport," she said, squeezing my arm. "Not everyone would take it so gracefully." Gracefully, as if humiliation were a test I'd passed. I told myself not to be ungrateful. I told myself love didn't have to be measured in dollars or deeds. I told myself stories I'd been practicing since childhood. And because I told them often enough, they sounded like truth. That night after everyone left, I stayed to help clean up. Of course I did. My mother moved more slowly then, the performance over, her face slack with tiredness. She watched me fold napkins, stack chairs, restore the house to order. "You're always there," she said softly. "That's why I trust you." Trust, another word that sounded like praise and felt like a lock. I carried the quilt out to my car when I finally left, cradling it carefully, as if it might bruise. The fabric was warm from the house, from all those bodies and voices, from the weight of what had just been decided. I remember setting it on the passenger seat and glancing at it before driving away, a strange sense of finality settling in my chest. Years later, in that quiet guest room, the memory made my hands tremble as I traced the seam again. I could still hear the laughter, still feel the way the room had tilted when gifts were ranked and mine placed neatly at the bottom, disguised as sentiment. I pulled the thread a little more, the stitch loosening, the opening widening just enough for my fingertip to slip inside. Whatever was hidden there had waited patiently, stitched into place while I learned to wait, too. And suddenly, the day gifts were ranked no longer felt finished. I wasn't born sentimental. I was trained into it, shaped slowly by repetition, by expectation, by the quiet rewards given for softness and the subtle punishments delivered for wanting more. When I was young, I noticed things other people didn't seem to notice. The way my mother's voice changed depending on which child she was speaking to. The way praise landed heavier on some of us, lighter on others, like it had been weighed in advance. I learned early that being observant was not the same as being important. Observation was useful. Importance was reserved. The label started gently. "You're the emotional one," my mother would say, smiling like it was a compliment. "You feel things deeply." She said it the way other parents said smart or strong. At school, teachers said I was thoughtful. At home, that thoughtfulness became currency, valuable only if spent on others. If someone forgot a birthday, I remembered. If someone was sick, I stayed. If a fight broke out, I smoothed it over. I didn't do these things because I was asked. I did them because the room felt wrong when they weren't done, and I had learned that discomfort was my responsibility to manage. My siblings learned different lessons. They learned how to ask, how to negotiate, how to say no without apology. When they wanted something, they named it plainly. When I wanted something, I edited the wanting out of my voice. "You don't need much," my mother told me once, after I declined something without being offered. "You're simpler than the others." Simpler. I wore that word like a badge, not realizing it was being used to explain my absence from the list of needs worth meeting. As we grew older, the roles hardened. My oldest sister became the achiever, the one whose success reflected well on the family. My brother became the project, the one who needed investment, guidance, rescue. And I became the support beam, invisible until removed, praised only for holding everything else up. At holidays, the pattern repeated itself so reliably it could have been scripted. Someone would need help in the kitchen, and my eyes would flick up before my body moved. Someone would vent quietly in a corner, and I'd find myself there, nodding, absorbing. My mother watched all of this with approval that never quite turned into protection. "She's so understanding," she'd tell people. "She doesn't make things difficult." I didn't understand, not really. I complied. There's a difference, but no one seemed interested in learning it. The word sentimental followed me like a shadow. It was used to explain why I liked handmade things, why I kept old letters, why I didn't push back when my turn was skipped. Sentimentality, in my family, meant accepting less with gratitude. When I questioned it, gently, always gently, I was met with confusion that bordered on irritation. Why are you making this about money? My sister asked once when I mentioned how uneven something felt. You care about the meaning more than the value. That's just how you are. Just how you are. As if it were a fixed trait, not a role I'd been assigned. I remember one specific afternoon, years before the quilt, when the label settled into place permanently. We were cleaning out my grandmother's house after her funeral. Boxes everywhere, dust thick in the air. My siblings claimed furniture, artwork, anything that caught their eye. I drifted from room to room, cataloging memories instead of objects. In the back of a closet, I found a small tin filled with handwritten recipes, all in my grandmother's careful script. I brought it out, smiling, and my mother's face softened in a way I rarely saw. "Oh," she said, "you'd love that." She handed it to me without discussion. No one argued. No one wanted it. It was assumed to belong to me because I was the one who would appreciate it. That was the moment, I think, when the family stopped seeing me as someone who might want something tangible. I had been sorted. After that, every exchange followed the same logic. When something practical was given, it went to someone else. When something emotional surfaced, it came to me. I became the keeper of feelings, the archivist of the family's softer remnants. At first, it felt special. Being trusted with memories felt like intimacy. But intimacy without reciprocity turns into labor, and labor done quietly becomes invisible. My mother leaned into the narrative whenever it suited her. If I hesitated, she reminded me who I was. "You're not like them," she'd say, meaning it as reassurance. "You don't measure love in things." I wanted to ask her how she measured it, but I never did. Some questions feel dangerous even before you know why. Over time, the praise grew sharper, edged with expectation. "I knew you, understand. I can count on you. You won't make this hard for me." Understanding became a requirement, not a choice. I understood when plans changed without notice. I understood when decisions were made without me. I understood when my needs were postponed indefinitely. And every time I understood, the role deepened. The quilt fit neatly into that narrative. Handmade, time-consuming, emotionally rich. It was the perfect symbol of who they believed me to be. The daughter who valued effort over outcome, intention over impact. The one who would never say, "But what about me?" In the guest room, needle in hand, I felt the weight of all those moments pressing down on my shoulders. The quilt wasn't just fabric. It was a culmination, a physical manifestation of years spent being manageable. I thought about my mother sewing it, stitch by stitch, her thoughts moving where mine never had permission to go. Did she see it as generosity, as balance, as justification? Or did she know exactly what she was doing, choosing sentiment as a way to sidestep equity? The seam loosened further under my fingers. I paused, heart racing, and pulled my hand back again. There was a part of me that didn't want to know. Knowing would mean the label had never been a misunderstanding. It would mean it was strategy. I pressed my palm flat against the quilt, grounding myself in its familiar weight. All my life, I had been told who I was. Sentimental, understanding, easy. What if that had never been my nature at all? What if it had been camouflage? The opening in the seam was wide enough now to slip 2 fingers inside. I hesitated, breath shallow, aware that whatever I touched next would change more than just my understanding of the quilt. It would change the story I'd been telling myself about why I was always the one expected to accept less. When I finally allowed myself to look directly at what my siblings had been given over the years, it felt like committing a small betrayal against the version of myself that had survived by not counting. I had learned early that tallying made me uncomfortable. Numbers introduced sharp edges where I preferred smooth explanations. So I told myself stories instead. Stories about timing, about need, about circumstance. Stories that turned disparity into coincidence. But sitting there with the quilt open just enough to hint at its secret, I realized how much effort it had taken not to see the pattern. My oldest sister's gifts were always described as investments. Tuition paid outright when she decided to go back to school. A down payment quietly transferred when she bought her first house. Later, help with renovations, nothing flashy, just enough to add value. Each time, my mother explained it as practicality. "She has a good head for these things," she'd say. "It makes sense." My brother's gifts came wrapped in urgency. He was always on the brink of something, failure or breakthrough, it was hard to tell. His car broke down, my mother stepped in. He lost a job, she bridged the gap. When he decided to move, she covered the costs because he needs a fresh start. The money flowed toward him like a safety net, invisible until he fell. Then there was my younger sister, whose gifts were ornamental. Jewelry passed down with ceremony. A piece of land that had once belonged to an uncle. Things meant to be seen, to be worn, to be admired. My mother liked giving her gifts that could be shown off, proof of lineage and favor. And me. I received stories. I received explanations about why what I was being given mattered more than money ever could. I received reminders that not everything valuable could be measured. I received reassurance that I was different, special in a way that made comparison inappropriate. At the time, I nodded. Comparison felt petty. I told myself I didn't want what they had. Wanting implied envy, and envy implied smallness. I had already been made small enough. But memory has a way of revisiting scenes with new lighting. Once you see the imbalance, it's everywhere. There was the year my sister's taxes were paid because she was overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed that year, too, but I didn't say it out loud. I cooked dinners instead, dropped them off in foil containers, told myself this was just how families worked. There was the loan my brother never repaid, reframed as help because he'll pay it forward someday. When I paid for something, medical bills, school supplies for nieces and nephews, groceries during lean months, it was assumed to be a gift. No one ever suggested I might need it returned. Even the language was different. Their help was described as assistance, support, stepping stones. Mine was called generosity, kindness, sacrifice, noble words that asked nothing in return. I started to remember moments I dismissed at the time, conversations that had ended too quickly, requests that had been phrased like compliments. "You're so good at managing on your own. You don't really need help. You've always been strong." Strong enough to go without. One afternoon stands out now, though at the time it barely registered. We were all sitting around my mother's dining table, paperwork spread out, talking about estate planning in that vague, uncomfortable way families do when they don't want to be explicit. My mother mentioned that she was taking care of things for everyone, making sure we were all set. I asked carefully what that meant. She smiled at me, indulgent. "You don't need to worry," she said. "You'll be fine." Fine, not secure, not provided for, fine. My siblings nodded, already satisfied. The conversation moved on. I sat there, hands folded, feeling foolish for having spoken at all. As I aged, the gap widened. What had once been subtle became structural. My siblings built lives buffered by resources I didn't have access to. They took risks because failure wouldn't be fatal. I stayed cautious because one misstep would have been entirely my own. When they struggled, it was a crisis. When I did, it was a character-building exercise. I thought about the times I'd quietly adjusted my expectations downward. The apartment I didn't upgrade, the vacation I didn't take, the medical care I delayed because it could wait. I told myself I was frugal, responsible, sensible. I didn't tell myself I had learned not to expect help. The quilt lay across my lap as these memories paraded through me, heavy with implication. Fabric doesn't judge, it just holds. I imagined my mother sewing while knowing exactly what she had already given away, what she was still planning to give. Did she see the quilt as balance, as consolation, or as a way to silence future questions before they were asked? Because that's what it had done. For years, the quilt sat like an answer. An object that said, "This is your share." And because it was handmade, because it came with a story, it was harder to challenge. I realized then that sentimentality had been used as a substitute for equity. Emotion in place of resources. Praise instead of protection. My siblings didn't see it that way. When I tried once to articulate the difference, my sister laughed lightly and said, "You always turn things into feelings." As if facts were her domain and emotion was mine. But facts were sitting in front of me now, stitched into cloth. The firmness beneath the quilt was impossible to ignore anymore. It felt like a ledger pressed between layers of batting and fabric, a secret that had waited patiently while I learned not to ask. I slipped my fingers inside the opening again, this time without flinching. Whatever was there had been hidden carefully, deliberately. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message deferred. As I touched the edge of something solid, something that did not belong in a quilt, I understood that the gifts my siblings received had never been random. They had been planned. And so had mine. The praise always came first. That was the pattern I hadn't named until much later, the way affirmation arrived ahead of expectation, softening the ground so the demand could sink in unnoticed. My mother was skilled at this, though I doubt she ever thought of it as skill. To her, it was simply communication. To me, it became conditioning. "You're the one I never have to worry about," she would say, her voice low and warm, as if she were sharing a secret meant only for me. I absorbed those words like a child absorbs sunlight, not realizing that something so sustaining could also burn. Worry, in her world, translated to expense, inconvenience, unpredictability. By declaring me worry-free, she was also declaring me exempt from care. It sounded like trust. It felt like love. It functioned like abandonment. When I helped, I was praised. When I endured quietly, I was admired. When I made myself smaller to fit the space left for me, I was called mature. Over time, the reward structure became clear, even if I never admitted it to myself. If I wanted affection, I had to earn it through compliance. If I wanted peace, I had to provide it. The first time I remember feeling the cost of this was subtle enough that I almost missed it. My car needed repairs, nothing dramatic, just enough to be inconvenient. I mentioned it casually, not as a request, just as a fact. My mother nodded sympathetically, then launched into a story about my brother's latest setback. By the end of the conversation, I was comforting her about him, my own problem neatly erased. "You'll figure it out," she said at the door, squeezing my hand. "You always do." And I did. I always did. That was the problem. Each time I solved something on my own, it became evidence that I didn't need help. Each time I swallowed disappointment, it was logged as resilience. The ledger of praise grew thick with entries that justified my exclusion from future consideration. I began to notice how differently my mother spoke to my siblings. With them, her praise was paired with provision. "You've been working so hard, let me help. You've had a rough year, you deserve this." Their struggles were met with resources. Mine were met with admiration. "You're so strong," she'd say, whenever I hinted at fatigue. Strength, I learned, was not something she wanted to support. It was something she wanted to rely on. There were moments when the praise tipped into something sharper, something almost possessive. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she'd say, and I'd feel a flicker of unease beneath the warmth. Because what she was really saying was that my presence made her life easier, that my usefulness was a constant she depended on. Once, after a particularly exhausting week, I told her I was overwhelmed. The word felt dangerous in my mouth, like a confession. She listened, nodded, then smiled in that familiar way. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You carry so much and you never complain." I had just complained. She had simply reframed it. The praise became a way to redirect me, to steer me back into my role whenever I strayed too close to asking for something. It was gentler than refusal, more effective than denial. By the time I realized what was happening, I had internalized it so completely that I began to police myself. I'd start to ask, then stop. I'd feel the urge to say no, then hear her voice in my head reminding me who I was. Sentimental, understanding, the one who didn't make things difficult. My siblings, meanwhile, learned a different lesson. When they needed something, they stated it plainly. When they were unhappy, they expressed it loudly. Their emotions created movement. Mine were absorbed, neutralized, repurposed into stability. At family gatherings, I watched this dynamic play out in real time. Someone would make a request, my mother would sigh dramatically and then comply. Later, she'd pull me aside and say, "Thank you for not adding to my stress." As if my silence were a gift. I began to feel a quiet resentment that had nowhere to go. It sat in my chest, heavy and hot, but I didn't know how to express it without breaking the image I'd been praised into maintaining. The idea of disappointing her felt worse than the reality of disappointing myself. The quilt, I realized, was praise made tangible. Hours of labor, thoughtful details. A gift that said, I see you for who you are, but it also said, this is enough for you. My mother had given it to me with the same tone she used for all my rewards, soft, intimate, final. There was no suggestion that more might come later, no hint of balance or adjustment. The quilt closed the conversation before it could begin. Years passed, and the praise continued to extract its cost. I missed opportunities because I didn't feel entitled to pursue them. I stayed longer in places that depleted me because leaving felt selfish. I became so good at carrying weight that no one noticed when it began to crush me. The worst part was how invisible the transaction remained. From the outside, I looked loved, appreciated, valued. People commented on how close my mother and I were, how lucky I was to have such a bond. They didn't see the asymmetry. They didn't hear the unsaid expectations embedded in every compliment. They didn't feel the way my body tensed whenever I considered setting a boundary. In the guest room, with the quilt open on my lap, the realization landed with a dull finality. The praise hadn't been free. It had been payment in advance for my silence, my labor, my acceptance of less. I thought about all the times I'd been thanked instead of helped, all the moments I'd been admired instead of supported. The pattern was so clear now that it was almost embarrassing I hadn't seen it sooner. But seeing it now mattered. It changed the meaning of everything that came before. My fingers brushed against the hidden object again, and this time I didn't pull away. Whatever my mother had stitched into this quilt, it wasn't just a secret. It was a continuation of the same logic, something concealed beneath praise, waiting for the moment I finally stopped mistaking appreciation for care. I took a breath, steadying myself, and widened the opening just a little more. The cost of praise, I was learning, was finally about to be revealed. My mother's voice returned to me then, uninvited but unmistakable, as if the quilt itself had learned how to speak in her tone. "Promise me," she had said, folding it into my arms with a care that bordered on reverence. "Promise you'll keep it. Don't ever give it away." At the time, the request didn't strike me as strange. She'd spent months working on it, stitching late into the night, her lamp glowing in the corner of the living room while the rest of us slept. Of course she wanted it valued. Of course she wanted it kept. I had nodded without hesitation, sealing the promise the way I sealed most things, with compliance. But now, sitting alone in that guest room, the memory replayed itself with sharper edges. She hadn't said it lightly. There had been urgency in her voice, just enough to register, not enough to question. And her eyes, those had lingered on mine a beat too long, searching for something I hadn't known to withhold. I thought back to other objects she'd given away over the years. Furniture, jewelry, paperwork. None of those came with instructions. None required a vow. Only the quilt carried that weight, that insistence. I had kept it everywhere I went. Through moves, through downsizing, through periods where I owned less than would have fit in the trunk of my car. The quilt survived purges that claimed everything else. I never questioned why. When friends admired it, I deflected. "It was my mom's," I'd say, as if that explained its untouchable status. When someone suggested donating old linens during a move, I felt an unexpected spike of anxiety, my refusal immediate and uncharacteristically firm. I didn't connect that reaction to my mother's request. I told myself it was sentiment, loyalty, habit. But promises have gravity. They pull at you long after the words are spoken. There were moments over the years when the quilt felt like a burden more than a comfort. It took up space I didn't have. It needed care I didn't want to give. Still, I folded it carefully each time, smoothing it the way I'd learned, as if mistreatment would be a kind of betrayal. I remember once during a particularly lean period considering selling it. Not seriously, just as a thought experiment. I looked up handmade quilts online, curious what they went for. The prices surprised me. Good work was valued. Time had worth. The idea lasted less than a minute before guilt shut it down. I could almost hear my mother's disappointment, feel the shift in her affection if she ever knew. I closed the browser and folded the quilt back into its place, my chest tight. Now, with the seam open and the hidden object pressing against my fingers, that guilt began to transform. It sharpened into something more honest. Had she known I would keep it at all costs? Had she counted on my obedience, my tendency to honor promises even when they no longer served me? The question settled heavily in the room. I studied the quilt more closely, noticing details I'd overlooked before. Certain seams were reinforced more than others. Certain patches aligned too neatly, as if they'd been planned around something rather than randomly arranged. The craftsmanship was still there, but now it looked strategic. I thought of my mother sewing alone, making decisions stitch by stitch. What had she been thinking? Was she protecting something, hiding it? Or was she simply ensuring that whatever she couldn't hand me openly would still end up in my possession? The promise echoed again. Don't ever give it away. Not don't damage it, not don't forget it. Give it away, transfer ownership, let it leave you. I felt a chill move through me as the implications settled in. The quilt hadn't just been a gift, it had been a vessel. My fingers trembled as I explored the opening again, brushing against the edge of something firm and smooth. Paper, maybe, cardboard, definitely not fabric. The shape was too deliberate, too contained. I withdrew my hand and sat back, suddenly aware of my breathing, the quiet hum of the house around me. The guest room felt smaller now, the walls closer, as if they were listening. All my life, I had been told what not to do. Don't ask, don't push, don't make it difficult. The quilt added another command to the list, one I followed without resistance. Don't give it away. I wondered what would have happened if I had. If years ago I donated it during a move, left it behind in a moment of exhaustion or indifference. Would the secret inside have been lost forever? Would that have been the point? A strange anger rose in me, not explosive but steady. The kind that comes when you realize someone has been counting on your predictability, when your compliance has been factored into a plan you never agreed to. I pressed my palm flat against the quilt, feeling the hidden object beneath the layers. It felt like a boundary I was finally crossing, a rule I was finally breaking. The promise no longer felt sacred. It felt manipulative. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure to whom. The girl who had promised so easily. The woman who had carried the quilt without question. Or the mother who had asked for obedience disguised as sentiment. Carefully, deliberately, I widened the seam another inch. The thread gave way with a soft sound, almost a sigh. The opening was large enough now that I could slide my hand inside fully. Wrap my fingers around the object and pull. But I didn't. Not yet. Because once I did, there would be no pretending the promise had been harmless. No returning the quilt to its quiet role as comfort and cover. Whatever my mother had hidden here had waited years for this moment. And I needed to be ready to meet it. I told myself to slow down, but my hands didn't listen. They moved with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent her life repairing what other people broke. Hemming pants, stitching buttons, mending small tears before they became disasters. It was muscle memory, the kind that lives deeper than thought. The needle slid under the thread, the seam loosened, and the quilt opened the way a mouth opens when it finally decides to tell the truth. I set the sewing kit beside me on the bed, careful not to spill pins onto the carpet. The guest room lamp cast a soft circle of light, and outside that circle the corners of the room looked dimmer than they had a minute ago, as if the air itself had shifted. My phone lay face down on the nightstand. I didn't want the world interrupting whatever this was becoming. I traced the opening again. The fabric edges curled slightly, exposing the batting beneath, yellowed in places, thin in others, like time had pressed on it unevenly. Then my fingers met the firm rectangle again, and my stomach tightened. It wasn't panic exactly. It was recognition. The feeling you get when you realize you've been in the wrong room of your own life, listening to the wrong conversation, agreeing to the wrong terms. I pulled my hand back and stared at the quilt. For a long moment, I did nothing but listen to my own breathing, the quiet inhale, the slower exhale. In the hallway, somewhere farther away, a floorboard creaked, the house settling. Or maybe it was only my imagination, suddenly alert to every sound. "Okay," I whispered, and the word sounded too loud in the stillness. "Okay." I leaned forward again, not with haste but with caution. I slid 2 fingers inside, then 3. The object had a smooth edge, like laminated paper or a stiff envelope. It was snug, wedged between layers as if it had been sewn around, not simply tucked in. That detail mattered. Tucked things fall out. Sewn things are meant to stay. I tried to pull gently, testing. It didn't budge. Of course it didn't. My mother had never been careless. If she hid something, she hid it properly. A memory surfaced, her sitting at the kitchen table, threading a needle with that quick twist of her fingers. "You don't rush a seam," she'd say. "You rush and you ruin it. You take your time and it holds." Back then, I thought she meant fabric. Now, I wondered what else she'd practiced holding together. I shifted the quilt so the opening faced the lamp. The stitches along the seam were smaller than the others, tighter, more deliberate. Someone had gone back over them, reinforcing the closure. I leaned closer, squinting, and noticed a second thread, a slightly different shade, almost invisible against the patterned fabric. A repair on top of a repair. My throat went dry. This wasn't the original seam. It had been reopened once before, and then sewn shut again. My mind jumped immediately to the simplest explanation. Maybe the quilt had torn and my mother had fixed it before giving it to me. But the thought didn't settle. The stitches were too precise, too controlled, like someone working with intention rather than urgency. And if it had been torn, why not mention it? Why not say, "Be careful, that spot was weak"? Instead, she had said, "Promise me you'll never give it away." I sat back, quilt spread across my lap, and felt something in me harden. Not cruelty, not bitterness. Just a quiet resolve, the kind you develop when you're tired of being confused by other people's love. I needed proof, not feelings, not interpretations, proof. I went to my bag and pulled out a pair of small scissors, the kind I used for thread and tape, always kept sharp. I held them in my palm for a moment, weighing what it meant to cut into something my mother had made. There was a reverence in that hesitation, but underneath it there was also anger. Reverence had kept me obedient for too long. "I'm not ruining you," I murmured to the quilt, as if it were a person I needed to reassure. "I'm opening you." The scissors slipped under the reinforced thread. I snipped once. The sound was tiny, crisp, final. A thread relaxed, the seam loosening just a fraction more. I snipped again and another. The opening widened and the quilt seemed to exhale. My heartbeat sped up. I paused, pressed my fingertips to the fabric, and waited. Nothing happened. No lightning, no voice from the ceiling, just cloth and silence and my own courage moving forward. I cut a little more, careful not to slice the inner layers. The reinforced stitches gave way with surprising ease, like they had been waiting for someone to challenge them. The opening became a clean gap, wide enough now for my whole hand. I slid my hand inside and felt the object more fully. It was wrapped in something, plastic, maybe, or waxed paper. The surface was smooth and cool against my skin. I found one corner and tried to lift it. Still stuck. Not by glue, I realized, but by the way it was positioned. The quilt had been constructed around it. If I wanted it out, I would have to open more than one seam. I would have to dismantle part of the quilt itself. A wave of reluctant admiration passed through me. My mother hadn't just hidden something. She had engineered the hiding. She had turned the quilt into a lock. My mind began to race, pulling together scraps of memory like pieces of fabric. The night she stayed up sewing while the rest of us slept. The way she looked tired but determined in the morning. The way she flinched when someone joked about my little blanket. The way her hand lingered on my wrist when she gave it to me, as if she were anchoring me to a promise. Had she been afraid? Of my siblings? Of me? Of what would happen if the secret surfaced too soon? Or had she been confident? Confident I would keep it, protect it, carry it without question. I swallowed hard and opened another seam along the edge, just a few inches, then another. The work was delicate, slow, oddly intimate. With each snip, the quilt became less of a gift and more of a construction. It was as if I were peeling back the layers of my family's story, and I could feel how carefully it had been stitched to keep me from seeing. As I worked, I talked softly without meaning to, the way I used to talk when I was calming children or soothing an anxious friend. "It's okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who needed to hear it. "I've got you. I'm being careful." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was comforting the very object that might contain the reason I needed comforting in the first place. I freed one side of the hidden rectangle and it lifted slightly. The quilt sagged around it, relieved of some internal tension. I could feel the weight now, heavier than paper should be, but not as heavy as a book. Something like a stack, a bundle, a collection. My fingers brushed a raised line beneath the wrapping, edges of folded pages, maybe, or envelopes layered together. My mind jumped again to money. Cash hidden like an emergency stash. But then I thought of my mother's face when she gave it to me, not triumphant, not generous, but haunted. Money didn't match that expression. I pulled the bundle up a little more and felt it catch again on another seam. I sighed, frustrated, then stopped. Frustration could make you careless. Carelessness could destroy whatever was inside, and I suddenly knew in my bones, that whatever this was, it mattered. I set the quilt down flat on the bed and stood up to steady myself. The room tilted slightly, not from dizziness, but from the sheer shift in meaning. For years, that quilt had been a symbol of my role, soft, yielding, sentimental. Now it looked like evidence. I walked to the window and lifted the blind, letting in a slice of colder light. Outside, the neighbor's porch light had come on. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and a car passed with tires hissing on damp pavement. Life continued in its ordinary way, indifferent to the moment my past was cracking open. I pressed my forehead to the glass and closed my eyes. "What did you do, Mama?" I whispered. The question didn't feel accusatory. It felt like grief. When I turned back to the bed, the quilt waited, its seams loosened, its secret nearly free. My hands felt steadier now, as if the question had anchored me. I picked up the scissors again and returned to the edge that still held the bundle captive. "One more," I told myself. "Just enough." The thread parted with a soft snap, and the bundle shifted in my palm, finally giving way. Wrapped tight and tucked deep, it rose out of the quilt like a buried thing pulled from earth. The letters were neat, the same careful slant she used on grocery lists and birthday cards. Seeing it there, inside plastic, made my chest tighten so hard I had to sit down. I lowered myself onto the mattress, bundle in my lap, and just stared, as if looking long enough might make the words turn harmless. I touched the plastic with my thumb. The bundle was sealed like a keepsake, protected from moisture, protected from time, protected from everyone except me. A flashback hit, my mother at the dining room table years ago, papers spread out, a pen tapping against her teeth. I brought her a mug of tea. She looked up, startled, then smiled too quickly. "You didn't see anything," she said, half joking. I laughed and said, "I never see anything." Her smile slipped for a second. "That's why you're safe," she murmured, almost to herself, then sent me out for envelopes. My palms were damp. I wiped them on my jeans and forced my breathing to slow. In for 4. Hold, out for 6. It helped, but it couldn't change the fact that my mother's handwriting was staring back at me from inside the quilt like a witness. I turned the bundle over carefully. Underneath the plastic I could feel edges, several layers stacked and squared, a thick fold of paper, a smaller envelope, something flat and firm like a card. It wasn't one thing. It was many things gathered together with intention. For a moment I held it against my chest, and the absurdity of it made my eyes sting. I had spent years being the family's safe place, the drawer where everyone stored what they didn't want to carry. Now I was holding something my mother couldn't, or wouldn't, hand me openly. I pictured her sewing late at night, pausing to listen for footsteps, smoothing the quilt back over the bundle as if tucking a lie to sleep. Did she expect me to find it only after she was gone? Or did she expect me to protect it the way I protected everyone else? The thought made my stomach twist. Whatever this was, it had been sitting inches from my skin for years, and I had never known. Not until tonight. Not until I finally dared to open the seam. "Why?" I whispered, and the answer arrived before comfort did. "Because I would keep it. Because I would carry it. Because I would not throw it away." I lifted the bundle closer to the light and read the first line of her writing, my pulse thudding in my ears. And on the outside of the wrapping, pressed flat beneath clear plastic, I saw my mother's handwriting. My mother's handwriting had not changed. That was the first thing I noticed, even before I registered the words themselves. The same careful slant, the same deliberate spacing, the same way she crossed her T's with a short, decisive line as if she didn't believe in excess. Seeing it there, pressed flat beneath plastic, tucked inside the quilt, felt like stepping into a room she had just left. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to read it. I held the bundle in both hands, resting it on my knees, and stared at the ink as though it might rearrange itself if I waited long enough. The guest room was silent again, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. I peeled back the plastic slowly, the sound faint but loud in my ears. Inside was a stack of papers, folded with care, edges aligned. On top lay a single sheet, my name written across it in my mother's hand. No envelope, no seal, just my name as if she'd always intended it to reach me eventually. My chest tightened. I unfolded the paper once, then again, smoothing it flat the way she had taught me. The first line was dated, years earlier than I expected, years before the quilt had been finished. That detail alone sent a chill through me. Whatever this was, it had been planned far in advance. "My dear," the letter began. I stopped there. My vision blurred, and I had to blink hard to clear it. She hadn't called me that out loud in years. Seeing it written felt intimate in a way that made my throat ache. I forced myself to continue. The words were careful, restrained, as if she were afraid of saying too much. She wrote about family, about fairness, about mistakes that couldn't be undone once they were spoken aloud. She wrote about protection and about silence and about choosing the path that caused the least disruption. I read slowly, line by line, my mind scrambling to keep up with the implications. She acknowledged imbalance without numbing it. She admitted to decisions made under pressure. She spoke of trust placed in the wrong people and of regret that arrived too late to fix things cleanly. My hands began to shake. Beneath the letter were other documents, copies of legal papers, dates circled in pen, notes scribbled in the margins. I recognized some of the names immediately. Siblings, relatives, people who had smiled at me across dinner tables while standing on ground they hadn't earned. There were amounts listed, transfers noted, amendments initialed. Evidence. Not speculation, not feelings. Evidence stitched into cloth and handed to the one person least likely to throw it away. I felt something inside me split open, not violently but decisively. The story I had told myself for years, the one where I was simply less in need, less interested, less entitled, cracked under the weight of proof. This hadn't been neglect. It hadn't been misunderstanding. It had been management. My mother hadn't forgotten me. She had counted on me. Counted on my silence, my patience, my tendency to carry what others could not. She had hidden the truth with the person she believed would protect it until the right moment, if that moment ever came. I looked back at the letter, at the final lines written in slightly heavier ink. "I gave this to you because I trust you to know when to open it," she wrote, "and because I trust you to survive what's inside." The room seemed to tilt, just slightly. Survive. Not celebrate, not benefit from, survive. I folded the letter carefully and set it back on top of the stack. My hands felt numb, my thoughts sharp and strangely calm. The humiliation, the years of being labeled sentimental, the praise that had kept me compliant, it all rearranged itself into a new pattern. This wasn't about love being uneven. It was about power being hidden. I looked down at the quilt spread open on the bed, its seams cut, its secret exposed. For the first time, it no longer felt heavy. It felt emptied, like it had finally served its purpose. The quilt had never been meant to keep me warm. It had been meant to keep the truth close. And now that truth was in my hands, undeniable and dangerous, waiting for me to decide what to do with it next. I spread everything out on the bed the way an investigator might, though I had never thought of myself as someone who investigated anything. For most of my life, I accepted. I absorbed. I adjusted. But the moment the contents of the quilt touched open air, something in me recalibrated. This was no longer about feelings. This was about facts. The papers were old but preserved, their edges crisp beneath layers of plastic and careful folding. My mother had protected them the way she protected nothing else, as if weather and time themselves had been enemies. I sorted the stack slowly, resisting the urge to skim. Skimming was what I did when I wanted to avoid impact. I needed to feel this fully. There were letters first, several of them, written in my mother's hand, dated across different years. Some were addressed to me, others were not. Seeing names that weren't mine made my stomach twist. These were never meant for my eyes, yet here they were, stitched into my inheritance like a confession hidden inside a prayer. I read one letter aloud without realizing it, my voice unfamiliar in the quiet room. It wasn't dramatic. That was the most unsettling part. The language was restrained, cautious, managerial. She wrote about adjustments, about family harmony, about choices that had to be made to avoid unnecessary conflict. There was no apology. There was justification. I set the letter aside and picked up the next document, then the next. Copies of legal forms, deeds with names crossed out and replaced, dates circled in red pen, initials in the margins. I recognized the handwriting instantly, even where she'd tried to disguise it by pressing harder or angling the letters differently. She had always underestimated how well I knew her. I began to understand why she'd hidden this from everyone else. These were not mistakes. They were decisions. A receipt caught my eye, folded smaller than the rest. I smoothed it flat and stared at the amount printed at the bottom. It took a second for the number to register. Then my chest tightened and the room seemed to pull inward. I knew that number. I had paid it once. Or rather, I had believed I had. The receipt told a different story. I traced the date with my finger, memory rising to meet it. That had been the year my brother was struggling, the year everyone agreed we needed to pull together. I remembered the conversation clearly, remembered being asked if I could help, remembered saying yes without hesitation. I remembered wiring the money, telling myself it was temporary, that family always balanced out in the end. But the receipt showed the money hadn't gone where I was told it had. It had been redirected, rerouted, absorbed into something else entirely. Something permanent. Something that now bore someone else's name. I felt heat crawl up my neck, sharp and nauseating. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was reallocation. I flipped through more pages, hands moving faster now, anger lending momentum. Each document carried the same quiet efficiency. Funds transferred. Assets reassigned. Decisions made in rooms I had not been invited into, justified by narratives I had been fed afterward like crumbs meant to keep me calm. I found notes my mother had written to herself in the margins. Short phrases, reminders. Talk to her later. She'll understand. Don't explain too much. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. I sat back on my heels, papers spread everywhere, quilt shoved aside like an afterthought. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, eyes wide, face pale. I looked like someone who had just survived an accident she hadn't known she was in. For a moment, I wanted to laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because the clarity was almost absurd. All those years of being told I was imagining imbalance, that I was too sensitive, that money wasn't the point. Here it was, itemized, documented, stitched into fabric and handed to me with a smile. I picked up another letter, this one addressed to a lawyer. It was brief, formal, and devastating. My mother discussed changes she wanted made quietly, contingencies she needed protected. She referenced my siblings by name, their needs spelled out, their futures considered. When she mentioned me, it was in a single line. She does not require provision. The sentence sat there, unadorned like a verdict. My hands shook as I set the letter down. I thought of every time I had swallowed my needs because I believed they were smaller, less legitimate. I thought of the nights I'd reassured myself that love couldn't be measured, that I was above such calculations. I thought of how eagerly I had played my part. A realization settled in slowly, heavy, and undeniable. My mother hadn't simply favored my siblings. She had relied on my compliance to make the imbalance possible. Without my silence, without my understanding, the structure would have collapsed. I was not an oversight. I was a buffer. I gathered the documents into piles, grouping them by year, by type, by the story they told. The story grew clearer with every page. This wasn't a single betrayal. It was a pattern, a system, a quiet economy of trust traded for control. My chest ached with a grief that had nowhere to land. Grief for the mother I thought I had. Grief for the version of myself that believed patience would be rewarded. Grief for the years spent carrying weight that had never been meant to be shared. At some point, my anger cooled into something sharper. Focus. Rage was too loud, too consuming. Focus felt usable. I reached for my phone and took a photo of the first document, then another, then another. The click of the camera sounded louder than it should have, each capture a small declaration. I was no longer holding this alone. As I worked, memories threaded themselves through the evidence, each one reframed by what lay in front of me. The holidays where I was praised for being low maintenance. The conversations where I was told to wait, to trust, to believe things would even out eventually. The times I was made to feel unreasonable for asking questions that now had clear answers. I paused when I reached the bottom of the stack, where the oldest documents lay. These were the foundations, the earliest decisions. I handled them with care, aware that this was where the story began. One paper in particular stopped me cold. It was a draft, unsigned, with handwritten notes all over it. My mother had crossed out my name entirely and written it back in smaller letters in the margin, like an afterthought. The symbolism was so on the nose it almost hurt. I closed my eyes and let the anger wash through me fully for the first time. It came fast and fierce, a wave that threatened to knock me flat. I let it. I had earned this anger. It was the natural response to years of manipulation dressed up as love. When the wave passed, what remained was resolve. I gathered the papers back into a neat stack, aligning the edges the way my mother had taught me, not out of reverence but out of control. This was mine now. Not just the evidence, but the narrative, the truth. The quilt lay discarded at the foot of the bed, seams open, its secret extracted. I looked at it once more and felt nothing but clarity. It had served its purpose, just as I had served mine. The difference was that my service was over. I slid the documents back into their protective covering, then into my bag, my movements deliberate and calm. My hands no longer trembled. My breathing steadied. Something fundamental had shifted. They thought I was sentimental, that I would treasure effort over outcome, emotion over equity, harmony over justice. They thought my understanding could be counted on indefinitely. That mistake was sewn into this quilt. And now it was coming undone. I thought I was prepared. That was my first mistake. I had already seen enough to know this wasn't accidental, enough to understand that my mother had orchestrated a quiet redistribution of loyalty and resources while teaching me to applaud my own exclusion. I believed the shock had already landed. I believed the worst of it was behind me. Then I unfolded the document that changed everything. It was thicker than the others, heavier in my hands, folded with a precision that suggested importance. The paper was official, letterhead, signatures, dates stamped cleanly at the bottom. Not a note, not a copy of a copy, an original. I recognized the address immediately. My mother's old attorney. The same man who had attended family dinners, who had laughed politely at my jokes, who had once patted my hand and told me I was such a good daughter. My stomach tightened as I read. This document wasn't about adjustments or temporary measures. It wasn't framed as protection or harmony. It was a formal transfer, assets moved decisively, legally, irrevocably. Property reassigned, beneficiaries renamed. My name appeared only once. Not as a recipient. As a waiver. The word sat there, stark and unforgiving, stripping years of emotional manipulation down to a single legal truth. I had been removed not by neglect, but by design. My consent, implied or assumed, had been recorded as fact. I read the paragraph again, slower this time, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes already knew. It stated that I had declined interest in certain holdings, that I had expressed a preference for non-material consideration. It framed my exclusion as a choice I had made freely. I felt something crack inside my chest, not a shatter, but a clean break, like bone under pressure. I had never declined anything. I had never been asked. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. I set the document down and stood, packing the length of the bed, my bare feet sinking into the carpet. Each step grounded me just enough to keep from spinning. Non-material consideration. That phrase replayed in my mind, over and over, each repetition sharpening its edges. It sounded like language pulled straight from my mother's mouth, refined into something that could survive legal scrutiny. It was sentimentality weaponized, compassion translated into consent. I thought of every time I'd said, "It's okay." Every time I'd waved off concern, smiled through disappointment, insisted I didn't need anything. Those moments had been harvested, distilled, and turned into evidence against me. I picked the document back up, forcing myself to read every line. The dates told their own story. This had been executed years ago, long before the quilt was finished, long before the gathering where gifts were ranked, long before I had begun to sense that something was wrong. The quilt hadn't been compensation. It had been containment. My mother had known that once this document existed, there would be no going back, no easy explanation, no way to justify it without revealing the imbalance she'd worked so hard to normalize. The quilt had been her solution, a soft distraction, a sentimental decoy. I sat back down, hands trembling now despite my effort to stay composed. Rage rose fast and hot, threatening to overwhelm the focus I'd fought to maintain. This was the moment where everything reframed, where memory itself began to rearrange. I remembered a conversation from years earlier, one I had dismissed as unimportant at the time. We were sitting at her kitchen table, drinking tea. She asked me casually if I felt taken care of. I laughed and said, "I don't need much." She'd smiled then, relief flickering across her face so briefly I'd barely noticed it. Now I saw it clearly. That smile had been confirmation. I looked again at the waiver. My supposed preference for non-material consideration had been recorded months after that conversation. Months, not years. The timing was too precise to ignore. My chest burned with a mix of fury and humiliation. I had been quoted without being present, interpreted without consent, reduced to a version of myself that was convenient for everyone else. I flipped the page and found handwritten annotations in the margin. My mother's handwriting again, unmistakable. She had circled the clause that removed me and written one word beside it. Necessary. Necessary for whom? The question echoed through me, unanswered and accusatory. Necessary to avoid conflict. Necessary to keep the peace. Necessary to ensure that no one with louder needs felt threatened by my quiet endurance. I thought of my siblings, of how confidently they moved through the world, buoyed by resources they rarely acknowledged. Had they known? Had they been told I didn't want what they were receiving? Had they believed the story as it was presented to them? A fresh surge of anger followed that thought, this one colder, more precise. It didn't matter whether they knew. They had benefited either way. I gathered the rest of the documents related to that transfer, laying them out in chronological order. Each one reinforced the same reality. Amendments followed. Secondary assets reassigned. Contingencies removed. There was no trace of hesitation. I felt something settle in me then, a kind of grim clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be resolved through conversation. It wasn't a hurt feeling to be soothed. It was structural injustice, reinforced by law and silence. The power dynamic had always favored those who demanded. I had mistaken my ability to endure for virtue, Not realizing it made me exploitable. The document in my hands was proof that endurance, when unprotected, becomes permission. I picked up my phone and photographed the waiver, then the signature, then the margin notes. Each click steadied me further. Evidence has that effect. It pulls you out of emotional freefall and gives you something solid to hold. As I worked, another memory surfaced, this one sharp and painful. A holiday dinner where my brother had joked about how I was the easy one. Everyone had laughed, including me. My mother had squeezed my shoulder affectionately. "You see," she'd said, "she doesn't need things to feel loved." The sentence replayed now, with a new ending. She doesn't need things. So we'll take them. I closed my eyes and breathed through the surge of anger that followed. This was bigger than resentment, bigger than sibling rivalry or parental favoritism. This was about being erased quietly, with paperwork and praise. I returned to the document one last time, reading the final paragraph. It stated that all changes had been made in good faith, with the belief that they reflected the wishes of all parties involved. Good faith. I laughed then, a short, humorless sound that surprised me with its bitterness. Faith requires honesty. This had required my absence. I folded the document carefully and placed it on top of the stack. My hands were steady now. The shock had done its work. What remained was something harder, more durable. Resolve. I no longer wondered whether I was imagining things. I no longer questioned my right to be angry. The paper in my hands had stripped doubt of its power. This was the first document that changed everything, not because it hurt, but because it clarified. It showed me the architecture of the betrayal, the way sentiment had been used to frame exclusion as choice. I gathered the stack and slid it back into my bag, the zipper sounding louder than it should have in the quiet room. The quilt remained open on the bed, its roll finished, its deception exposed. I stood there for a long moment, bag at my feet, feeling the shift inside me settle into place. I was no longer the confused daughter trying to understand what she had done wrong. I was a woman holding proof. And proof does not ask for permission. It prepares. Once I saw the numbers written down, I couldn't unsee them. They rearranged my memory the way a sudden diagnosis rearranges a life. Nothing from before disappears, but everything is reclassified. Innocence becomes negligence. Trust becomes liability. Love becomes an expense that was never reimbursed. I spread the receipts out beside the legal documents, aligning dates the way I used to align bills at my kitchen table late at night, calculator humming softly beside me. I had always been careful with money, not because I had much of it, but because I had learned early that no one else would be careful on my behalf. There it was again, the wire transfer from years ago, the one I had remembered as a family rescue. I could see myself clearly in that moment, sitting alone in my apartment, laptop open, cursor blinking as I hesitated just long enough to pretend I was considering saying no. I remembered telling myself it was temporary, that family money always moved in circles, that what went out would come back around when I needed it. It never did. The document told me where it had gone instead, not toward emergency relief, not toward repayment of debt, but toward permanence, equity, security, something that would grow quietly over time while I continued to shrink my own expectations. I flipped to another receipt and felt the same sickening recognition. Medical expenses, school fees, travel costs incurred during crises that were never mine. Each one came with a memory attached, vivid and inconvenient. I remembered sitting beside my sister's hospital bed, paying invoices while she slept, reassuring nurses that it was fine. I had it handled. I remembered missing work without complaint, covering meals, covering childcare, covering the invisible gaps that appear when someone else's life collapses and yours is expected to absorb the impact. No one ever said thank you in a way that suggested closure. Gratitude was expressed as assumption, not acknowledgement. Of course I would help. Of course I would manage. Of course I would figure it out. I told myself that was what love looked like. But the receipts told a different story. They told me how much it had cost to be dependable, How expensive it had been to be the one who never needed anything back. I kept going. There were checks I didn't remember writing until I saw my own signature staring back at me. It was steadier then, less careful, written by a woman who still believed generosity was a form of safety. I felt a flash of tenderness for that version of myself, followed quickly by anger on her behalf. She hadn't been foolish. She had been groomed. Each payment lined up neatly with a family crisis I could recall in detail. The year my brother's business failed. The summer my niece needed special tutoring. The winter my mother said things were tight and asked if I could cover a few things until spring. Spring always came. Relief never did. What gutted me most wasn't the total, though the total was staggering when I finally allowed myself to add it up. It was the contrast. The way my money had flowed outward freely, unquestioned, while assets were flowing inward toward everyone else, protected and growing. I found notes my mother had written to herself next to some of the amounts. She offered. She didn't hesitate. No need to involve others. That last one made my vision blur. No need to involve others. My willingness had become justification for exclusion. My silence had been translated into consent. By stepping up, I had stepped aside. I thought back to conversations where I'd been praised for being generous, for not keeping score. "That's what I love about you," my mother would say. "You don't turn everything into transactions." I hadn't realized she was doing that part for me. I sat back against the headboard, papers spread around me like fallen leaves, and felt something deep inside my chest finally give way. It wasn't sobbing. It was something quieter and more devastating, a release of denial. I had given money I couldn't afford to lose because I believed it bought belonging. I had paid into a system that rewarded me with approval and excluded me from security. And I had done it willingly, proudly, because I had been taught that asking for return was ugly. There was a particular receipt that stopped me completely. Smaller amount, ordinary, groceries. Dated from a month, I remembered vividly. That was the month my mother had called late one evening, her voice tight with stress. "Things are a little complicated right now," she'd said. "I hate to ask, but could you help with a few basics?" I had gone to the store the next morning, filled a cart, dropped the bags off at her house, kissed her cheek, and left before anyone else arrived. She had hugged me harder than usual that day. "You're a lifesaver," she'd said. The receipt showed that same week. She had transferred a significant sum into an account that bore my sister's name. The juxtaposition was obscene. I stared at the paper until my eyes burned, then closed them, letting the anger surge fully this time. It rolled through me, hot and relentless, burning away excuses I had clung to for years. This wasn't about generosity. It was about extraction. I had been the family's unacknowledged reserve fund, the quiet pool everyone drew from while pretending it wasn't there. And because I never framed my help as a loan, because I never demanded acknowledgement, it had been easy to treat it as infinite. The evidence forced me to confront something I had avoided my entire life. My sacrifices had been convenient, not noble, not misunderstood, convenient. That realization hurt more than the numbers. I gathered the receipts into a stack and began photographing them, one by one, careful to capture dates, amounts, annotations. Each image felt like a small act of rebellion. I was counting now. I was recording. I was refusing to let generosity erase accountability any longer. As I worked, memories surfaced faster, sharper. The vacations I'd skipped, the retirement savings I'd postponed, the opportunities I'd turned down because I didn't have a cushion to fall back on. Meanwhile, my siblings had cushions, thick ones, cushions partially stuffed with money I had given without counting. I had told myself it didn't matter because love was not transactional. But love that drains one person to enrich others is not love. It is a system. I felt strangely calm as that thought settled, calm and awake. I arranged the papers back into their categories and slid them into my bag alongside the legal documents. The weight was noticeable now, tangible. Evidence has mass. It pulls on your shoulder when you carry it, reminding you it's there. For the first time, I didn't resent that weight. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror again. The woman staring back at me looked older than she had an hour ago, but also clearer, less pliable, less willing to blur herself for the comfort of others. I thought of my mother's voice, the way she had praised me for not keeping score. I finally understood what that praise had cost me. I had paid in advance for my own exclusion, and I was done paying. The phrase echoed in my head as I packed the documents away, neat and orderly, as if order could soften what they revealed. Be patient. My mother had said it so often that it felt like advice stitched into my bones. Whenever I questioned timing, fairness, or my own exhaustion, patience was offered like a virtue I should aspire to rather than a delay tactic designed to quiet me. I had accepted it because patience sounded kind, mature, reasonable. Only now did I understand how efficiently it had been used to stall me while decisions hardened without my input. I remembered the first time she used it on me deliberately, not reflexively. I had been in my early 30s, old enough to know when something felt off but still young enough to doubt myself. We were sitting on her porch, the late afternoon sun slanting across the boards, tea sweating in our glasses. I had asked, carefully, whether there was a plan for later, for the future, for all of us. She smiled, reached over, and squeezed my hand. "Be patient," she said. "These things take time." I had nodded, embarrassed by my own question, relieved to be reassured. I didn't realize that later had already been decided without me. As I moved through the documents again, a pattern emerged that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with language. Every delay had been justified. Every omission had been softened. When things weren't explained, it wasn't because I didn't deserve an explanation. It was because explaining would have disrupted the arrangement. "Be patient" had been the lullaby sung to keep me compliant. I began replaying conversations with new ears, hearing the pauses I'd ignored, the gentle deflections I'd mistaken for care. When I'd asked about inheritances in vague terms, my mother had tilted her head and said, "You don't need to worry about that right now." When I'd hinted at feeling overlooked, she'd sighed and reminded me how stressful things were for everyone else. Patience, in those moments, had not been about timing. It had been about containment. The more I examined it, the clearer it became. My siblings were rarely told to be patient. They were told to act, to claim, to move quickly before opportunities passed. Urgency surrounded them like a current pushing them forward. I was encouraged to wait until the current had already carried everything away. I found a handwritten note tucked between two legal pages, almost missed it. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a reminder my mother had written to herself. "If she asks again, say not yet." Not yet. The words felt like a slap. There it was, in plain ink, proof that my questions had not been forgotten or misunderstood. They had been anticipated and managed. A script had existed long before the conversation ever happened. I sat on the edge of the bed, the note in my hand, and felt a slow burn rise in my chest. It wasn't explosive rage. It was something steadier, more dangerous. Moral injury, the pain that comes when you realize someone you trusted violated not just your expectations, but your values. I had believed patience was a shared virtue. That waiting together meant something. In reality, patience had been unevenly assigned. I waited so others could move unchallenged. I thought of all the times I had swallowed urgency of my own. The job offer I delayed responding to because my family needed me close. The move I postponed because it wasn't a good time for anyone else. The decisions I deferred because I was told to wait until things settled. Things never settled. They just settled without me. Gaslighting crept in alongside patience, subtle and corrosive. When I felt uneasy, I was told I was overthinking. When I expressed discomfort, I was reminded of how lucky I was. My emotions were never outright denied. They were reframed until they became unrecognizable. "You're imagining problems that aren't there," my sister had said once, laughing lightly. "Mom treats us all the same." The documents in front of me said otherwise. I realized then that patience had been paired with minimization. Be patient. Don't make a fuss. It's not that serious. These phrases worked together to dull my instincts, to teach me to mistrust my own perception. And it had worked, for years. I remembered a specific holiday dinner, years back, when the topic of finances had come up accidentally. Someone mentioned a property my mother had helped purchase. I'd been surprised, not because of the help, but because I hadn't known about it at all. My mother had shot me a warning glance before smiling broadly. "We'll talk about it later," she'd said. Later never came. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need details, that patience was proof of maturity. Now I saw that patience had been a muzzle. I felt foolish for how effective it had been, but I refused to stay there. Shame would only serve the same system that had silenced me in the first place. What I felt now was clarity, and clarity demanded action. I began to mark the documents with small sticky notes, color-coding them by theme. Red for assets transferred, blue for language used to justify delays, yellow for references to my supposed preferences. Patterns emerged quickly, undeniable once you looked for them. The same phrases appeared again and again in different forms. Non-material consideration. She understands. She doesn't need. Wait until later. It was a strategy. Not conscious cruelty, perhaps, but strategy nonetheless. And strategies have beneficiaries. The realization shifted something fundamental in me. I stopped framing my anger as betrayal alone and began to see it as self-defense arriving late but necessary. I had been morally injured, not because I was greedy or entitled, but because I had been manipulated into forfeiting agency. That mattered. I picked up my phone again and photographed the handwritten note, then the clauses that echoed its sentiment. Each image felt like reclaiming a piece of my voice. If patience had been used to silence me, documentation would be my answer. As I worked, I felt the emotional arc inside me change. The shock was fatting, the fury was sharpening. What remained was focus, cool, deliberate, unyielding. I was done waiting, done being told not yet, done allowing my silence to be interpreted as consent. Be patient had been the phrase that kept me in place. I folded the note and placed it carefully back with the others, not out of reverence, but out of respect for evidence. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accuracy, about telling the story as it actually was, not as it had been softened for my consumption. The bed beside me was still scattered with papers, the quilt forgotten for now, its role reduced to what it had always been, a container for delay. I took one last look at the documents before sliding them into my bag, feeling the familiar weight settle against my side. It no longer felt like burden. It felt like leverage. For years, patience had been demanded of me, while decisions were made in my absence. That phase was over. From here on out, I would not wait to be told. I would act. There is a moment that keeps replaying now, sharper each time I revisit it, because I finally understand what was happening beneath the surface. It was an ordinary afternoon, unremarkable in every way except for what it concealed. I had driven to my mother's house after work, tired but determined, carrying a question I had rehearsed in my head the entire way. I remember the feel of the steering wheel under my palms, the way I practiced my tone out loud, calm, respectful, non-accusatory. I wanted answers, but I didn't want conflict. I had already learned how dangerous honesty could be if it sounded like demand. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, moving between counters with the familiar rhythm of someone who knew the space by heart. The smell of soup filled the room. It was domestic, comforting, disarming. She smiled when she saw me, wiped her hands on a towel, and asked how I was doing as if nothing in the world were misaligned. I sat at the table and waited until the moment felt right, which in hindsight meant I waited until my courage had begun to thin. Finally, I asked, not directly, not clearly. I asked the way someone asks when they have been trained to soften their own needs. "I've been thinking," I said, staring at the grain of the table, "about the future, about how things are set up." She didn't stop moving. "What do you mean?" she asked lightly. I want to make sure I understand," I continued. "About what to expect, eventually." She turned then, leaned against the counter, and crossed her arms. Her expression was patient, affectionate, faintly amused. "You don't need to worry about that," she said. "Everything's taken care of." That should have been the end of it. For years, it always was. But something in me pressed forward anyway, quiet but insistent. "I know," I said. "I just want to understand how it works, for all of us." Her smile tightened just slightly. "Why?" she asked. The question landed like a test. I felt it immediately, the shift in power, the subtle demand that I justify my curiosity. I chose my words carefully, aware of how easily they could be turned against me. "I guess I want a plan," I said. "I don't want to assume anything." She sighed, the sound heavy with practiced fatigue. "You're overthinking," she said. "You always do this." There it was, the familiar reframing. My question was no longer about clarity. It was about my temperament. "I just thought," I began. She interrupted gently. "You don't need to worry about money," she said. "You've always been different from the others. You don't measure things that way." I felt my face flush, embarrassment mixing with something sharper. "That's not what I meant," I said. "I just—" She came over then and placed a hand on my shoulder, warm and grounding. "I know," she said softly. "And I love that about you. You trust. You understand. You don't make everything complicated." The conversation ended there. Or rather, it was ended for me. I left shortly afterward, feeling oddly ashamed, as if I had violated some unspoken rule by asking at all. On the drive home, I told myself I had misread the moment, that she was right, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that my curiosity was unnecessary. Now, with the documents spread out in front of me, that memory burned. She had lied to me, calmly, efficiently, with affection. The proof sat in my bag, undeniable. Everything had not been taken care of, at least not for me. The system had already been finalized by the time I asked that question. My role had been decided, my exclusion formalized. And she had looked me in the eye and told me not to worry. I replayed the scene again, this time with the documents in mind. The waiver had already been signed, the assets already transferred, my supposed preference for non-material consideration already recorded. When I asked about the future, she hadn't been unsure. She had been protecting a lie. The realization made my stomach twist. It wasn't just that she had deceived me. It was how easily she had done it, how natural it had felt to her, how little effort it had taken to redirect me with praise and dismissal. I thought of the way she'd touched my shoulder, the warmth of her hand. That gesture, which I had always interpreted as comfort, now looked like control. A way to anchor me in place while steering the conversation away from danger. I wondered how many times that had happened. How often I had been guided, soothed, redirected away from truth without realizing it. The thought made my chest ache with a grief that was difficult to name. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. I picked up the document that contradicted her words most directly, the one that formalized my removal. I read the date again, then counted backward. The conversation in the kitchen had happened weeks after this was executed. Weeks. She had known. The lie had not been spontaneous. It had been rehearsed. I felt anger rise, hot and immediate, but it didn't spiral the way it might have once. It settled into something steadier, more contained. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about recalibration, about revisiting every memory with new information and refusing to minimize what emerged. There were other moments, too, once I let myself look. Times I had asked questions and been met with reassurance instead of answers. Times I had been told to trust, to wait, to believe that things would be fair eventually. Each one now glowed with the same sickly light. She hadn't been confused. She had been managing. I imagined what would have happened if I had pressed harder that day in the kitchen. If I had demanded specifics. If I had refused to be soothed. Would she have told me the truth? Or would the lie have grown sharper, more defensive? The question didn't matter anymore. The answer was already written in ink. I felt a strange gratitude for the documents, for their cold clarity. They didn't soften. They didn't reassure. They didn't tell me I was overthinking. They simply stated what had been done. I gathered the relevant pages and set them aside, grouping them under a new mental category: lies told directly to my face. Seeing them framed that way made my jaw tighten, but it also strengthened my resolve. This was no longer about miscommunication. It was about deception. The image of my mother in the kitchen lingered, the domestic calm, the soup simmering, the towel over her shoulder. It struck me then how effective that setting had been, how trust is easiest to exploit when it feels safest. I had asked her respectfully, carefully. I had given her every opportunity to be honest without embarrassment. She had chosen otherwise. That choice mattered. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, feeling the weight of that realization settle. The version of myself who had left her house that day, confused, slightly ashamed, determined not to ask again, felt very far away now. I was no longer her audience. I was her witness. The lie had cost me years of clarity, years of planning, years of informed choice. It had cost me the ability to advocate for myself when it mattered most. But now the cost had shifted. I placed the documents back into my bag, aligning them carefully, the way I did everything now, with intention. The woman who would have confronted her impulsively, emotionally, was gone. In her place stood someone quieter, more dangerous. Someone who no longer needed answers spoken aloud. Someone who had proof. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began with small disturbances, the kind you only notice if you've spent years reading rooms for survival. A delayed reply. A message that sounded warmer than it needed to be. A question asked twice in different ways, as if the first attempt hadn't landed. I hadn't told anyone what I'd found. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't even hinted. But secrets have a way of sensing exposure, and families built on silence feel it first. The first call came from my sister. Her name lit up my phone late one afternoon, and my body reacted before my mind did, a familiar tightening in my chest. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. That would have been the old me, avoiding discomfort, postponing truth. Instead, I answered. "Hey," she said, her voice bright, almost cheerful, too cheerful. "Hey," I replied, neutral, careful. "I was just thinking about you," she said. "It feels like we haven't really talked in a while." We had talked, often, but never about anything that mattered. "I've been busy," I said. "I know," she replied quickly. "We all have, I just wanted to check in." There it was, the check-in, a phrase that sounded caring but functioned as surveillance. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Well," she continued, laughing lightly, "Mom mentioned you were sorting through some old things. Cleaning, I guess." My grip tightened on the phone. "She mentioned that?" I asked. "Yes," my sister said, then hesitated. "I mean, just in passing." Just in passing. The phrase landed like a lie. "Old things tend to pile up," I said. "Eventually you have to look at them." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." I thanked her and ended the call shortly after, my tone polite, my words sparse. When I hung up, my heart was racing, but my mind was clear. They knew something had shifted. They didn't know what. The next call came from my brother 2 days later. No small talk, no preamble. "Mom says you've been asking questions," he said. I almost smiled. "Have I?" I asked. "Don't play games," he replied. "If there's an issue, we should talk about it." We should talk about it. The collective language surfaced immediately, as if rehearsed. Problems were communal when they threatened the structure. Until then, they were individual failings. "I haven't asked you anything," I said. "But you're upset," he insisted. "Am I?" I asked. Another silence. I could hear his breathing, heavy, irritated. He had never been good with ambiguity. He preferred confrontation when he had the upper hand. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "You know Mom did her best." There it was, the shield, the appeal to effort over outcome. "I'm not discussing Mom," I said calmly. "Then what are you discussing?" he snapped. I let the question hang, let him feel the discomfort of not knowing. "I'll call you back," I said, and ended the call before he could respond. After that, the messages started. Not accusations, not yet, just concern, offers of help, invitations to talk. Each one carefully worded, each one circling the same unspoken fear. What does she know? I watched the pattern unfold with a strange sense of detachment. This was the same family that had dismissed my discomfort for years, now suddenly attentive to my emotional state. The irony was almost laughable. My younger sister texted next. If something bothering you, you can tell me. You don't have to carry everything. The words echoed back at me like a cruel joke. I typed, erased, then typed again before settling on a single sentence. I'm handling it. The reply came almost immediately. Handling what? I didn't respond. That was when the tone shifted. Concern hardened into irritation. Curiosity sharpened into suspicion. My silence, once celebrated, now felt threatening. I could sense them recalibrating, trying to figure out how to pull me back into the familiar role. The peacemaker, the understanding one, the sentimental one. My brother left a voicemail that night, his voice tight with forced calm. We're family, he said. If you have a problem, you don't just go quiet. That's not fair. Fair? The word tasted bitter. Fairness had never been the metric when I was absorbing discomfort for everyone else. I didn't respond, not because I was afraid, but because I was learning something important. Silence, when chosen deliberately, feels different. It's not avoidance, it's control. 2 days later, my oldest sister called. Her approach was subtler, more strategic. I'm worried about Mom, she said without greeting. She's been anxious. Of course she had. She's not sleeping well, my sister continued. She keeps thinking she's done something wrong. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. What makes her think that? I asked. She says you've been distant, my sister replied. She doesn't understand why. I almost laughed then, a short, sharp sound that startled me with its edge. Of course my mother didn't understand. Understanding had never been required of her. I've been busy, I repeated. My sister sighed. You know how she is, she worries. The implication hung heavy in the air. Your silence hurts her. Your boundaries are cruel. Your clarity is dangerous. I'm not responsible for managing her feelings, I said quietly. The line went dead for a second. That's not what I meant, my sister said quickly. I just think if there's something, we should clear it up before it becomes a big thing. There it was, the fear made explicit. This could become a big thing. I pictured the documents in my bag, the receipts, the waiver, the notes, the years of manipulation reduced to paper and ink. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, quickly tempered by resolve. I don't need to clear anything up, I said. Not right now. Then when? She asked, frustration creeping into her voice. When I'm ready, I replied. I ended the call before she could argue. That night, I lay awake replaying every interaction, not with doubt, but with analysis. I watched how quickly concern turned into pressure, how offers of support masked demands for reassurance, how my refusal to explain destabilized them. They had never needed me to speak before. They had needed me to stay predictable. I realized then that my role had not just been to absorb emotional labor, but to provide moral cover. As long as I appeared content, the system could continue unchallenged. My silence validated their comfort. Now that silence was no longer comforting. The next morning, I received a group message. We need to talk, my brother wrote. All of us. The collective again, strength in numbers, a united front designed to overwhelm. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back. Not today. The response was immediate. This is getting out of hand. I set my phone down and felt something solidify inside me. This was the panic phase. The moment when those who benefit from imbalance sense its exposure and scramble to contain it. They didn't want dialogue. They wanted reassurance. I stood and walked to the window, watching the street below, the ordinary world continuing as if nothing had shifted. Somewhere inside me, a quiet certainty took root. They knew I knew. They just didn't know how much. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't rushing to make that uncertainty easier for them. The moment I stopped asking questions, everything changed. Not outwardly, not yet. The world didn't crack open or rearrange itself on cue. No one called to confess. No doors slammed. But inside me, something fundamental shut down with a quiet, decisive click. The part of me that sought permission, that hoped clarity would be granted if I explained myself well enough, that part went still. I had spent years asking in ways designed not to threaten anyone. I asked gently, indirectly. I asked with disclaimers and smiles, with reassurances that I wasn't upset, that I understood, that I didn't need much. Every question came padded, softened, made safe. And every answer had been a lie, an evasion, or a delay. The realization didn't make me reckless. It made me efficient. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, searching for the perfect phrasing that might unlock honesty. I stopped imagining confrontations that ended in understanding. I stopped believing that clarity required consent from the people who benefited from my confusion. Instead, I focused on documentation. I cleared the bed again and laid everything out with a new kind of care. Not reverent, methodical. I grouped papers by category, then by date. I labeled folders on my laptop and began scanning, adjusting the light so every signature and annotation came through clean. Each file saved felt like a step taken quietly in the right direction. No one interrupted me. That too was telling. My phone buzzed periodically, messages I didn't open, calls I let ring. For once, urgency belonged to someone else. I moved at my own pace, unhurried, deliberate. This wasn't avoidance. It was strategy. As I worked, I noticed how much energy I once spent asking for reassurance. How draining it had been to explain myself over and over, to justify curiosity as if it were a flaw. Now, that energy redirected itself into action, and the difference was startling. I didn't feel powerless. I felt clear. Each document I scanned stripped another layer of doubt away. The facts didn't change depending on who looked at them. They didn't soften when spoken aloud. They existed, complete and unmoved by emotion. That solidity steadied me in a way conversation never had. At one point, I paused and looked around the room. The quilt lay folded in the corner, its purpose finished. It looked smaller now, almost ordinary. Without its secret, it was just fabric and thread. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I thought of my mother again, not with the ache of betrayal, but with a colder curiosity. Had she expected this moment? Had she known I would stop asking and start recording? Or had she believed I would remain what I had always been, patient, quiet, absorbing? The letter suggested she had anticipated my strength, but underestimated its direction. I trust you to survive what's inside. Survival had been the minimum. She hadn't accounted for what survival could turn into. I finished scanning the last document and backed everything up twice, once to an external drive, once to a secure cloud folder. Redundancy mattered. This was no longer just information. It was protection. As I packed the originals away, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm settle over me. Not relief, nothing was resolved yet, but readiness. The kind that comes when you stop hopping circumstances will change and start preparing for what they already are. I realized then how often asking had been used against me. Each question had revealed vulnerability. Each request for clarity had given others an opportunity to shape the narrative, to soothe, to redirect. Asking had kept me dependent on their version of events. Stopping ended that dependency. I sat down with my notebook and wrote a simple list. No commentary, no emotion, just facts. Dates decisions were made. Dates I was told to wait. Dates money moved. Dates I asked questions and received reassurance instead of truth. Seeing it all in one place was sobering. The pattern was undeniable. The waiting had never been mutual. It had been imposed. I closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For years, I had believed that understanding would protect me, that if I stayed calm and reasonable, fairness would eventually emerge. The documents had dismantled that illusion completely. Fairness does not emerge on its own. It is enforced. That thought didn't make me angry. It made me practical. I checked my phone at last. Missed calls. Messages escalating from concern to irritation to something sharper. I didn't respond. Not because I was afraid, but because I no longer needed to explain myself before acting. There would be time for conversations later if I chose to have them. They would happen on my terms, grounded in evidence, not emotion. Until then, silence was not submission. It was containment. I packed my bag carefully, tucking the documents deep inside, feeling their weight settle against my side. It felt different now, less like something I was carrying for others, more like something that belonged to me. Before turning out the light, I looked once more at the quilt. For years, it had represented who I was expected to be: sentimental, grateful, quiet. Now it represented something else entirely. A mistake. They had mistaken my patience for passivity, my silence for agreement, my endurance for consent. That mistake had cost them their advantage. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The questions that had once crowded my mind were gone, replaced by something steadier and far more dangerous. I wasn't asking anymore. I was preparing. And preparation, I had learned, was the first real form of power. The phrase came to me unexpectedly, not from any document or conversation, but from the quiet space between thoughts where truth finally has room to land. I had been the moral shock absorber, the one positioned strategically to absorb impact so the rest of the system could keep moving without damage. The one who took the hit quietly so no one else had to feel the jolt. It explained everything with brutal efficiency, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every family system needs one. Someone who absorbs tension, who cushions conflict, who makes sure the noise never reaches the center. In ours, that had been me. Not because I was the weakest, but because I was the most reliable. I didn't explode. I didn't demand. I didn't walk away. I endured. My mother had known that. She hadn't chosen me by accident. She had chosen me because I would hold. I thought back over the years and began to see how consistently I had been placed between fault lines. When siblings argued, I mediated. When finances got tight, I bridged gaps. When my mother was overwhelmed, I stepped in without being asked. My presence stabilized situations that might otherwise have forced hard conversations. And because I absorbed the pressure, those conversations never happened. I realized then that my role wasn't just emotional. It was ethical. As long as I remained calm, generous, understanding, the family could continue believing itself fair. My silence wasn't just convenient. It was essential. That realization landed heavily, but it also brought a strange clarity. It explained why my questions had always been deflected rather than answered. Why my discomfort had been reframed instead of addressed. Why my endurance had been praised so enthusiastically. I wasn't being rewarded for virtue. I was being maintained as infrastructure. The documents supported this interpretation in ways I hadn't noticed at first. There were references to stability, to keeping things smooth, to avoiding emotional fallout. None of that language was attached to my siblings. It followed me like a shadow, appearing whenever my name appeared in the margins. I had been the buffer that made unfair decisions feel less cruel. I remembered a particularly tense holiday years back, when my brother and sister had nearly come to blows over money. Voices were raised. Accusations flew. My mother's face had gone pale with panic. I stepped in without thinking, making jokes, redirecting attention, smoothing tempers until the storm passed. Later that night, my mother had hugged me tightly and whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without you." At the time, I felt proud. Now I understood the cost. By calming the situation, I had prevented exposure. By soothing egos, I had preserved imbalance. My role had been to ensure no one looked too closely at how things were actually distributed. The shock absorber absorbs until it fails. I felt anger rise again, but it was different now. Less raw, more targeted. This wasn't about hurt feelings. This was about being positioned deliberately to carry moral weight that didn't belong to me. I had been made responsible for the family's conscience. That was the injury. My siblings didn't have to question the fairness of what they received because I didn't contest it. My mother didn't have to justify her choices because I validated them through silence. The system worked because I worked. And I had worked hard. I thought about the emotional labor alone, the listening, the reassuring, the constant availability. How often had I put my own needs aside to make space for others' crises? How often had I been the one everyone turned to, not because I had solutions, but because I could be trusted not to make things worse? That trust had been exploited. The realization brought with it an unexpected grief, one that sat deeper than betrayal. I mourned the years I had spent believing my endurance was a moral good. I mourned the identity I had built around being the one who could handle it. Handling it had become my cage. I sat with that truth for a long time, letting it settle fully. The documents lay nearby, but I didn't touch them. I didn't need more proof. I needed to integrate what I already knew. My mother hadn't just hidden the truth from me. She had hidden it with me. She had trusted me to carry it, to absorb the weight of knowing without disturbing the balance. The quilt, the letters, the timing, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. I was the only one she believed strong enough to survive the truth without tearing the family apart. That belief was both a compliment and a betrayal, because survival should never be the bar for fairness. I thought of the letter again. The line that had stuck with me most. I trust you to survive what's inside. Not benefit from, not be protected by, survive. The more I considered it, the clearer it became. My mother had outsourced the consequences of her decisions to me. She had transferred not just assets, but moral burden. By hiding the truth in the quilt, she had ensured that when it finally surfaced, I would be the one holding it. I would be the one who knew. And knowing changes things. I felt a shift inside me then, subtle but irreversible, a ruckalabrushon of responsibility. I was no longer willing to absorb shock on behalf of others, not emotionally, not ethically, not financially. That didn't mean I wanted to hurt anyone. It meant I was done protecting them from discomfort that belonged to them. I stood and began organizing the documents again, but this time with a different intention. Not just to understand, but to prepare. Preparation felt like respect for myself, something I had long postponed. I made a list in my notebook, neat and concise. Transfers, dates, conversations, contradictions. I wrote without commentary, without judgment, letting the facts speak. Each entry felt like reclaiming a piece of agency that had been siphoned off over the years. As I worked, I noticed how calm I felt. Not numb, not detached. Calm in the way that comes after a hard truth has been accepted fully. The kind of calm that makes decisions possible. The phone buzzed again on the nightstand. Another message. I didn't check it. Their urgency no longer dictated my pace. I realized then that the role of shock absorber only exists if someone continues to supply the cushioning. It requires participation. Withdrawal collapses the system. That was the power shift. I wasn't required to confront anyone yet. I wasn't required to explain myself. I wasn't required to soften what was coming. All I had to do was stop absorbing. I closed my notebook and placed it atop the stack of documents, then slid everything carefully into my bag. The weight was familiar now, but it no longer felt like burden. It felt like leverage earned through endurance I no longer owed. As I zipped the bag closed, I felt something settle inside me, firm and unyielding. They had built a system that relied on my silence. They had mistaken my strength for consent. And now, with the truth fully in hand, I was done cushioning the impact of their choices. The shock was about to travel back to where it belonged. The first thing I noticed was how loud my silence became. I hadn't announced anything. I hadn't drawn lines or made threats or demanded explanations. I simply stopped responding the way I always had. No reassuring replies, no softening emojis. No, I understand sent out like a peace offering. I didn't disappear, I just removed the cushioning. And that, apparently, was enough to destabilize everything. At first, they mistook my quiet for exhaustion. A phase, something temporary that would pass if they waited long enough. That assumption was familiar, comfortable. I had been worn down before. I had always come back pliable. So they waited. When waiting didn't work, they escalated. The calls increased, the messages multiplied. The tone shifted subtly at first from concern to confusion. Just checking in. Hope you're okay. Haven't heard back from you. Each message framed as care, but stacked close enough together to feel like pressure. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing them. Not because I wanted to provoke. I simply didn't feel the old reflex anymore. The one that compelled me to soothe, to reassure, to make things comfortable again. That reflex had been trained into me. It wasn't innate. And once I recognized it as conditioning, it lost its authority. The silence stretched. Then came the recalibration. My sister tried humor first. "Wow, guess you're too important for us now," she texted, followed by a laughing emoji that landed flat. Humor had always been her way of testing boundaries without admitting she was testing anything at all. I didn't reply. My brother switched tactics. His message was blunt. "We need to talk. This is getting weird." Weird, as if my absence from emotional labor were a disruption rather than a correction. Still, I didn't reply. It surprised me how calm I felt. Not triumphant, not anxious. Calm in the way you feel when you finally stop holding your breath without realizing you were doing it. Days passed. The house didn't burn down. No one fell apart. Life continued. And that, I think, was when the panic really began, not because something bad happened, but because nothing did. They were discovering something uncomfortable. The system could survive without my participation. It just couldn't pretend to be fair anymore. I noticed it in the way messages began referencing each other. "Have you heard from her? She hasn't answered me either." They were comparing notes, triangulating, trying to locate me emotionally the way you might search for a missing object you're used to relying on. I had been the object. The stabilizer. The one who absorbed discomfort, so others didn't have to sit with it. Without me doing that work, the discomfort stayed where it originated. And they didn't like it. My mother was the last to reach out. She waited longer than the others, which didn't surprise me. She had always understood the power of timing. When her call finally came, it was early in the morning, her name lighting up my phone like a familiar weight. I let it ring. That choice felt heavier than the others, but it also felt necessary. For years, her voice had been the signal that reset everything, that pulled me back into alignment no matter how determined I'd felt moments before. I needed to know if the alignment would still snap into place automatically. It didn't. When the call ended, a text followed almost immediately. "I'm worried about you." There it was, the opening move. Concern framed as care, care framed as obligation. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone face down on the table. Worry had always been the hook. If she worried, I moved. If she was anxious, I adjusted. Her discomfort had priority access to my nervous system. Except now, I could feel the mechanism clearly. And because I could feel it, I could interrupt it. I went about my day deliberately, made coffee, opened my laptop, answered emails that had nothing to do with my family. The ordinariness grounded me. It reminded me that my life extended beyond their anxiety. By mid-afternoon, the group message arrived. "We're concerned. Can we please talk?" The word please sat there like a lever they expected me to pull. I didn't. The next message came an hour later. "This isn't healthy." I almost smiled. For years, what hadn't been healthy was my constant availability, my willingness to absorb tension that wasn't mine, my silence in the face of inequity. But that had never been named as a problem because it served them. My withdrawal did not. That evening, I noticed something else shift. The tone hardened. Concern gave way to irritation. Patience thinned. The messages grew shorter. "What's going on with you?" "You're being unfair." We don't deserve this. There it was. The entitlement surfaced. They weren't upset because they were worried about me. They were upset because they were uncomfortable, and they believed I was responsible for alleviating that discomfort. I was. I sat with that truth until it settled fully. The silence wasn't passive. It was active. It was a refusal to resume a role I no longer accepted. And because I hadn't announced it, because I hadn't dramatized it, they had nothing to push against directly. Silence offers no handles. That's what made it so unnerving. I thought of all the times I had been told to be patient, to wait, to trust that things would be handled eventually. Now, without saying a word, I was offering them the same experience. Wait. Sit with uncertainty. Trust that I'll respond when I'm ready. They didn't tolerate it well. By the third day, my brother's messages shifted from irritation to accusation. You're punishing everyone. This is manipulative. If you have something to say it. I read the messages without reacting, noticing how quickly silence was reframed as aggression when it no longer served them. I wasn't manipulating anything. I was opting out. That distinction mattered. Late that night, another message came, this one from my mother. I don't know what I did to deserve this. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Guilt, obligation, the suggestion that my silence was cruelty rather than boundary. For a moment, the old reflex stirred, the urge to explain, to reassure, to rush in and smooth the fracture before it widened. Then I thought of the quilt, the documents, the years of quiet redirection. And the reflex went still. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. Silence reveals who needs you confused. Reading it back, I felt something click into place. They were nervous not because I was angry, but because I was unreadable. They couldn't tell whether I would fold, forgive, or confront. They couldn't predict me. For the first time in my life, unpredictability belonged to me. And that frightened them. I closed the notebook and turned off the light, letting the room fall into darkness. My phone buzzed once more on the table, then went quiet. I didn't reach for it. Because silence, chosen, deliberate, unyielding, was no longer absence. It was presence. And it was working. When you're ready, say. Silence is tolerable when it feels temporary. It becomes a threat the moment people realize it might be permanent. That was the shift I felt on the fourth day. Up until then, their messages had carried the assumption that I would reappear, that whatever this was would resolve itself once I was sufficiently worried about their worry. But on the fourth day, something in the language changed. The requests sharpened. The patience evaporated. My silence stopped being framed as concern and started being treated like defiance. The first sign was urgency disguised as reason. My sister sent a long message, paragraphs instead of sentences, carefully structured the way people structure arguments when they believe logic will succeed where emotion has failed. She wrote about family values, about communication, about how unhealthy it was to shut people out. She wrote about misunderstandings and the danger of letting things spiral. Spiral was a word we used when control was slipping. She ended the message with, "If you're upset, we can work it out, but going quiet like this isn't fair." Fair again. Fairness, it seemed, only mattered when my behavior disrupted their comfort. I read the message twice, not to consider responding, but to study it. The tone was firm but conciliatory, authoritative without sounding cruel. This was how my family corrected deviation, not through confrontation, but through moral framing. They didn't tell you to comply. They explained why compliance was the ethical choice. I set the phone down and didn't answer. An hour later, my brother called. I watched it ring, noticing how my body stayed calm instead of tightening. That alone felt like a small miracle. He left a voicemail. His voice was clipped, irritated, but still restrained. "This is getting ridiculous," he said. "You can't just disappear and expect everyone to be okay with it. If you have an issue, you bring it to the family. That's how adults handle things." There it was, the authority play. By labeling my silence as childish, he attempted to strip it of legitimacy. Silence was only acceptable when it was weakness. When it was chosen, it became unacceptable. I deleted the voicemail without replying. By evening, the pressure intensified. Messages overlapped, arriving before I could forget the last one. My siblings were coordinating now, comparing notes, escalating together. The system was closing ranks. My mother hadn't reached out again yet, and that absence felt deliberate. She had always known when to wait and when to step in. I suspected she was watching the others try first, gauging whether they could pull me back into place without her having to intervene. That realization steadied me further. They didn't want answers. They wanted restoration. The family didn't need me to speak. It needed me to resume my role. The next message came from my younger sister, and it was different. Less polished, more emotional. "I don't know what's happening, but this hurts," she wrote. "We've always been close. If you're mad, just tell me." I stared at the words, longer than the others. This one was harder, because it reached for genuine connection rather than control. But even here, the burden was placed squarely on me. My silence was framed as harm, my boundary as cruelty. The possibility that I might be protecting myself was absent. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Then I put the phone down. Not because I didn't care, because caring had always cost me clarity. Late that night, the group message lit up again. "This has gone far enough." The sentence came from my brother, but the timing suggested consensus. "We're all affected by this," he continued. "You don't get to just opt out." Opt out. The words landed heavily because they revealed the truth plainly. My participation had never been voluntary. It had been assumed. My role was not something I chose. It was something I was expected to fulfill indefinitely. And now that I wasn't, they felt entitled to demand an explanation. I didn't give one. I went to bed instead, aware of the tension thrumming just beneath my skin, but no longer willing to soothe it away. For the first time, I let their discomfort exist without managing it. Sleep came slowly, but it came. In the morning, my mother finally called again. I stared at her name on the screen, my heart steady, my breathing slow. I let it ring out once more. The text that followed was different from the first. "Please call me." No worry this time, no explanation, just instruction. I recognized the escalation immediately. This was the pivot from concern to command. I didn't respond. That was when the narrative turned. By midday, the messages stopped asking how I was and started questioning my character. I was being dramatic. I was being unfair. I was making things bigger than they needed to be. The familiar language of minimization returned, sharpened by frustration. My brother wrote, "You've always had a tendency to withdraw when things get uncomfortable." The rewriting of history had begun. I read the message slowly, feeling the old urge to defend myself stir. The reflex to explain that withdrawal had always been my last resort, not my first. That I had stayed engaged far longer than was healthy. That silence was the only tool left when words were dismissed. I didn't send any of that. I wrote instead in my notebook. "They're afraid because I'm not reacting." Seeing it written down stripped the situation of its emotional fog. This wasn't chaos. It was cause and effect. My silence had disrupted the feedback loop. Without my reassurance, they had no way to confirm the story they told themselves about our family. Without my compliance, they were forced to confront the possibility that something was wrong. And that possibility frightened them. I realized then that silence wasn't just absence. It was information withheld. It denied them data they had always relied on: my tone, my expressions, my willingness to smooth things over. Without that data, they couldn't adjust their behavior to maintain the illusion of balance. The illusion began to crack. That afternoon, my sister tried one last approach. She called and left a voicemail, her voice tight with something that sounded like anger wrapped in concern. "You're acting like you're better than us," she said. "Like you're above talking things out." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it was inverted. I had spent years making myself smaller so no one would feel threatened. Now, simply by staying quiet, I was being accused of superiority. Power shifts do that. They distort perception. I deleted the voicemail and sat quietly, letting the realization settle. My silence had crossed an invisible line. It had stopped being interpreted as vulnerability and started being read as power. And power, in my family, was not tolerated unless it was controlled. That night, the group message lit up one final time. "We need to resolve this," my brother wrote. "This isn't going away." I looked at the message and felt a strange sense of gratitude. He was right. This wasn't going away. But not for the reasons he thought. I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the table, the gesture deliberate. The room felt calm, grounded, unthreatening. Nothing about my life felt out of control. Only their access to me had changed. I understood then that silence had become a threat because it exposed how much they relied on my participation to regulate themselves. Without me cushioning the impact, they had to feel the imbalance directly. And feeling it made them desperate. I sat with that understanding until it settled into certainty. Silence had done its job. It had shown me who panicked when they couldn't manage me. It had shown me who believed they were entitled to my availability. It had shown me how quickly concern turned into coercion when reassurance was withheld. And most importantly, it had shown me something about myself. I could hold this. I didn't need to rush into explanation or confrontation. I didn't need to justify my boundary to people who had never justified their choices to me. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. And whatever came next would happen on my terms. I didn't go to the lawyer looking for revenge. That surprised me once I realized it. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was going for clarity, for confirmation, for someone outside the family system to tell me whether what I was seeing was real. What I wanted, more than anything, was to stop feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. The office was quiet in a way my family never was. No layered conversations, no emotional static, just clean lines, neutral walls, a clock ticking with unapologetic precision. I sat in the waiting room holding my bag against my side, feeling the familiar weight of the documents inside it, but this time the weight steadied me instead of pulling me down. When the lawyer called my name, I followed her into an office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. She gestured for me to sit, then waited. Not impatiently, not expectantly, just waited. That alone felt unfamiliar. I started at the beginning, or what I thought was the beginning. I explained the quilt, the documents, the transfers. I heard myself minimizing as I spoke, using phrases like "I might be overreacting," and "I don't know if this is even worth bringing up." Old habits die hard. She didn't interrupt me. When I finished, she reached for the folder I slid across the desk and began reading. The room filled with the sound of pages turning, slow and methodical. I watched her face closely, bracing myself for dismissal, for skepticism, for that familiar look that suggested I was making a mountain out of a molehill. It never came. Instead, she frowned. Not dramatically, not with outrage, just a small, precise narrowing of the eyes that told me something mattered here. "How long have you had these?" she asked. "Not long," I said. "I found them recently." "And before that," she continued, "were you aware of any of these arrangements?" I shook my head. "No, I was told things were handled." She nodded once and kept reading. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt purposeful, like something was being assembled piece by piece. When she finally looked up, she folded her hands neatly on the desk. "You understand," she said carefully. "That being described as having declined interest is not the same as actually declining interest." I blinked. "I know I never declined anything." "I understand that now," she replied. "What I'm saying is that legally, those are two very different things." The words landed softly, but their impact was seismic. She went on explaining concepts I'd never been taught to consider. fiduciary duty, informed consent, misrepresentation. Each term peeled back another layer of the narrative I'd been fed for years. Where my family spoke in feelings, she spoke in definitions. Where they relied on implication, she relied on documentation. "You were positioned," she said, tapping one of the pages gently, "as someone who did not require provision. That position carries legal consequences, but it also requires evidence that you knowingly agreed to it." "I didn't," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. She looked at me directly then. "That's what I'm seeing." Something in my chest loosened just a fraction. Not relief, validation. She continued, her tone steady. "What concerns me most isn't just the redistribution of assets. It's the pattern. Repeated decisions made on your behalf without disclosure. Language that reframes exclusion as preference. That's not neutral." I swallowed. I was told to be patient, to trust. She nodded again, slower this time. "That language is often used to delay accountability." I laughed softly, the sound sharp with disbelief. Hearing it said out loud by someone who had no emotional stake in my family felt surreal. It was like watching a trick exposed from the audience's side of the stage. She slid one document back toward me. "This," she said, "is particularly important." It was the waiver. "This implies consent," she continued. "But consent requires knowledge. Without that, it's vulnerable." Vulnerable. The word echoed in my mind, turning over slowly. For years, I had been told I was too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive. Now the vulnerability wasn't mine. It was the structure built around my silence. "You have more rights than you think," she said then, the sentence unremarkable in tone and devastating in effect. I stared at her, something hot pressing behind my eyes. "I wasn't trying to cause problems," I said automatically. She raised an eyebrow. "Protecting yourself is not causing problems." The statement was so simple, so obvious, that it nearly undid me. She explained next steps without urgency, without pressure. Options, possibilities, what could be challenged, what would require careful consideration. She didn't promise outcomes. She didn't dramatize consequences. She treated the situation the way it deserved to be treated, as real. At one point, she paused and looked at me again. "May I ask," she said, "why you waited this long to come in?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was curious. I thought about my answer before speaking. "I didn't know I was allowed to," I said finally. Something flickered across her face then. Recognition. "That's common," she said quietly, "especially in families where one person carries the emotional load." The phrase sent a jolt through me. Emotional load. Another truth, named without apology. When the meeting ended, she walked me to the door and told me to take my time. To think, to breathe. "You don't have to decide anything today," she said, "but you should know that you're not imagining this." Outside, the air felt different. Sharper, colder, real. I sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the experience settle. The validation wasn't euphoric. It was grounding. It replaced confusion with responsibility. This was no longer a private reckoning. It was a matter of record. As I drove home, I thought about how much energy I had spent doubting myself. How many years I had waited for someone inside the system to confirm what I felt. It had taken 1 hour with someone outside it to dismantle decades of gaslighting. The difference wasn't intelligence. It was incentive. The lawyer didn't need me to stay small. She needed me to be informed. When I got home, I placed the documents back on the table and looked at them differently. Not as evidence of betrayal, but as leverage. Not as proof of my victimhood, but as confirmation of my agency. I picked up my notebook and added a new line beneath the others. Legal acknowledgement received. The words steadied me. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another message from my family. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. The conversation had shifted rooms entirely. I understood something now that I hadn't before. Silence had given me space. But knowledge gave me power. And power, once recognized, does not ask permission to exist. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and let the quiet settle around me, not as absence, but as choice. The next step would require a boundary. And for the first time, I knew exactly where to place it. The boundary arrived quietly. There was no announcement, no speech rehearsed in the mirror, no dramatic confrontation where I finally said everything I had swallowed for years. It came in the form of a single decision. I would no longer explain myself in advance. That was new. In the past, every limit I set came wrapped in apologies. I softened my refusals before they were even spoken, padded them with context, offered reassurance like a consolation prize. I wanted boundaries, but I also wanted approval, and those two desires had never coexisted peacefully. This time, something was different. The meeting with the lawyer had given me language, but more importantly, it had given me permission not from her, but from myself. I no longer needed my family to agree that a boundary was reasonable. I only needed it to be true. The opportunity to test this came sooner than I expected. My brother called the next morning, his name flashing on my phone like a dare. I watched it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but intention. I wanted to hear my own voice when I spoke to him. "Finally," he said, no greeting, no pretense. "We need to talk." I waited. "You've been shutting everyone out," he continued. "Mom's upset. This whole thing has gotten out of hand." Out of hand. The phrase implied chaos, loss of control, something dangerous that needed to be reined in. I noticed how quickly he positioned himself as the authority, the one who would restore order. "I'm not shutting anyone out," I said calmly. "I'm taking space." "That's not how family works," he snapped. "You don't just take space when people are worried." I could feel the familiar urge rise, the reflex to explain, to justify, to say I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I recognized it now as muscle memory, not instinct. "I'm not available to talk right now," I said. The line went quiet. "What?" he asked. "I said I'm not available," I repeated. My voice didn't shake. "This isn't a good time." "You can't just decide that," he said. "This affects all of us." There it was, the core belief exposed. "Yes," I said, "I can." The words felt solid as they left my mouth, like stepping onto ground that didn't give way beneath me. "You're being selfish," he shot back, frustration seeping through his restraint. "After everything Mom's done for you." I almost laughed. There it was again, the invocation of debt, the reminder of obligation, the expectation that gratitude should override autonomy. "I'm not discussing Mom," I said, "and I'm not apologizing for taking time." He exhaled sharply. "You've changed." "Yes," I said, "I have." Another pause, this one longer, heavier. "So what, you're just not going to talk to us now?" he demanded. "I didn't say that," I replied. "I said I'm not talking right now." "When then?" he pressed. I considered the question honestly. In the past, I would have offered a timeline, a promise, something to reassure him that control would be restored soon. This time, I didn't. "I'll reach out when I'm ready," I said. "You can't do that," he insisted. I just did. The silence that followed was electric. I could feel the shift happening in real time, the moment when he realized I wasn't negotiating, that the usual levers weren't working. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "I'm going to hang up now," I said. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine." I ended the call. My hand hovered over the phone for a moment afterward, adrenaline buzzing under my skin. I waited for the familiar rush of guilt, the flood of self-doubt that usually followed any assertion of independence. It didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet sense of alignment, like something had finally clicked into place. I had set a boundary, without apology. And the world had not ended. The rest of the day unfolded differently after that. Not outwardly, emails still arrived, chores still needed doing, but internally, the shift was profound. I noticed how much energy I usually spent bracing for backlash, how much mental space was devoted to anticipating other people's reactions. Without that weight, my thoughts felt clearer, lighter. That evening, my sister tried next. She texted first. "Can we please talk? This is tearing Mom apart." I stared at the message, feeling the familiar tug. This was her specialty, emotional urgency framed as moral responsibility. For years, it had worked flawlessly. I typed a response, then deleted it, typed again. Finally, I sent a single sentence. "I'm not available for this conversation right now." No explanation, no apology. The reply came quickly. "That's cold." I read it without reacting. Cold, the word had always scared me. It conjured images of distance, of being unlovable, of becoming the kind of person my family whispered about with disappointment. I had spent years proving I wasn't cold by overextending myself. Now I let the word sit. I didn't respond. The next message was longer, sharper. Accusations crept in, wrapped in concern. "You're hurting people. This isn't who you are. We're just trying to understand." I noticed how none of the messages acknowledged my right to step back. Understanding, in their language, still meant access. I set the phone down and walked into the kitchen, grounding myself in small, tangible actions. I made tea. I wiped the counter. I stood at the window and watched the sky darken, the ordinary rhythm of evening continuing without reference to my family's distress. Later that night, my mother left a voicemail. Her voice was soft, strained, carefully controlled. "I don't know what's going on," she said, "but I need you to call me, please." The old me would have called back immediately, heart racing, desperate to repair whatever had been broken. The new me listened to the message twice, then set the phone down. I didn't feel cruel. I felt steady. I realized then how often my boundaries in the past had been negotiated away before they were even tested. I had treated limits like requests rather than decisions, something others could weigh in on. This time, I wasn't asking. The next morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls and messages, all variations of the same theme. Confusion turning into frustration. Frustration hardening into accusation. "You're tearing the family apart. You're acting like a stranger. We don't deserve this." I read them slowly, noticing how the narrative had shifted. My boundary was no longer being questioned, it was being blamed. That was the cost of no longer apologizing. And I was willing to pay it. I wrote in my notebook, the pen pressing firmly into the page. First boundary set, no apology given. Reaction, panic. Seeing it written down stripped the situation of drama. This wasn't chaos. It was predictable. Systems resist change. People push back when roles shift. I wasn't being cruel. I was being unfamiliar. By afternoon, the messages slowed. Not because they accepted the boundary, but because they were recalculating. They needed time to adjust their approach, to figure out which lever to pull next. That realization made me smile faintly. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was observing. The boundary held. And in holding it, I felt something I hadn't expected. Respect for myself. Not pride, not defiance, respect. The quiet kind that comes from acting in alignment with your values, even when it's uncomfortable. I thought of the quilt again, folded away, its purpose complete. It had once symbolized my role as the one who absorbed, who endured, who accepted less without complaint. Now, it felt like evidence of how far I had come. That night, as I turned out the lights, I felt the aftershock of the boundary ripple outward, touching relationships that had long depended on my compliance. I knew this was only the beginning, that firmer lines would need to be drawn, that the backlash might intensify before it settled. But I also knew something else, something essential. I had set a boundary and survived it. I had not apologized. And for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. The first crack appeared where I least expected it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It came as a slip, a small contradiction that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't spent years learning how to read between words. My sister called late one evening, her voice tight, controlled, carrying the brittle edge of someone who had been holding something in too long. "I don't know what Mom told you," she said without preamble, "but that's not how it happened." I leaned back in my chair, phone resting loosely in my hand. "I didn't say anything about what Mom told me," I replied. Silence. A beat too long. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. There are a lot of stories going around right now." Stories, plural. I felt a slow, cold clarity spread through me. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about them trying to align their narratives and failing. For years, I had been the buffer, the translator, the one who smoothed inconsistencies before they could harden into conflict. Without me doing that work, the differences in their stories were colliding head-on. "I'm not involved in any stories," I said calmly. "Well, you are," she snapped, irritation breaking through. "Whether you want to be or not." I didn't respond. She sighed, the sound sharp with frustration. "Look, I just want to be clear about one thing. I didn't ask for anything. Whatever Mom did, she did on her own." The defensive tone was unmistakable. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the implication. If she was clarifying her innocence, it meant blame was already being assigned somewhere else. "I'm not accusing you," I said. "But you could," she replied, and there it was, fear. Fear of exposure, fear of documentation, fear that the truth, once loose, would not land evenly. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and thought about how quickly things had shifted. No more united front, no more collective concern. Now there were disclaimers, preemptive defenses, subtle distancing. The system was fracturing. The next sign came through my brother, who texted instead of calling, unusual for him. His messages were shorter, clipped, carrying the tension of someone trying to control damage. "You didn't hear this from me," he wrote, "but Mom's upset because people are saying different things." Different things. I almost laughed. "What kind of things?" I typed back. A pause, then, about who knew what and when. There it was. The question at the center of everything. Who knew and when? For years, the story had been simple. Mom handled things. Everyone trusted her. No one questioned the outcomes. I had played a crucial role in maintaining that simplicity by never forcing clarification. Now that simplicity was gone. "I'm not discussing anyone else's knowledge," I replied. "That's the problem," he shot back. "You're letting people assume." I set the phone down and didn't answer. It wasn't my job to correct their assumptions anymore. Within days, the triangulation intensified. One sibling would reach out to clear the air, only to contradict something another had said. Names were dropped casually, then retracted. Explanations shifted mid-sentence. I began to see the fault lines clearly. My oldest sister blamed my brother's financial instability for the decisions made. My brother blamed Mom's fear of conflict. My younger sister insisted she'd been kept in the dark entirely. Each version placed responsibility somewhere else, never squarely on themselves. And always, hovering beneath it all, was the unspoken awareness of me. The one person who now had proof. I noticed how often my name came up in conversations I wasn't part of. "She's been quiet. She hasn't said anything. Do you think she knows?" Knowing had changed my position completely. Before, my silence had signaled acceptance. Now, it signaled judgment, even though I hadn't voiced any. That was the power shift. One afternoon, my brother called again, his voice strained, stripped of its usual authority. "You need to talk to Mom," he said. "This is getting bad." "How so?" I asked. "She's upset. People are asking questions. Everyone's blaming everyone." I waited. "You don't understand," he continued. "Without you explaining things, it's just chaos." The word landed heavily. Chaos. In other words, without me stabilizing the narrative, the truth was destabilizing them. "I'm not responsible for managing that," I said. He exhaled sharply. "You've never been like this." I almost told him that I had always been like this, observant, aware, capable, but had simply chosen silence over conflict. Instead, I said nothing. Later that week, my younger sister showed up at my door unannounced. Her eyes were red, her posture rigid with nerves. I let her in, offering water, not comfort. I had learned the difference. "They're fighting," she said immediately. "Really fighting." I nodded. "She says he knew," my sister continued. "He says she pushed for it. Mom keeps saying she did what she had to." I watched her carefully. This wasn't concern anymore. It was panic. "They're all scared," she said. "They think you're going to, I don't know, do something." The truth of that sat between us, unspoken. "I haven't done anything," I said. "That's what scares them," she replied. After she left, I stood alone in the doorway for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle. The family had begun to cannibalize itself, not because I attacked, but because the structure that had protected them from accountability had been removed. That structure had been me. Without a shock absorber, every impact traveled directly through the system. Resentments surfaced. Old grievances reemerged. Conversations that had been deferred for decades were happening all at once, without moderation. And I wasn't in the middle of it anymore. I watched from a distance as alliances shifted. As siblings who had once stood shoulder to shoulder now eyed each other warily. As blame ricocheted from person to person, never settling comfortably. It would have been easy to feel vindicated. I didn't. What I felt was something quieter, heavier, inevitability. This was always going to happen. It had only been delayed by my willingness to absorb the strain. I thought about my mother then, about how carefully she had managed appearances. How much effort she had put into keeping peace by redistributing responsibility rather than addressing truth. I wondered if she had known that once I stepped aside, the whole thing would unravel. Perhaps that was why she had chosen me to carry the secret. Because she knew I was the only one who could delay the reckoning. The irony was sharp enough to sting. I hadn't caused this fracture. I had revealed it. That distinction mattered to me, even if it didn't to them. One evening, I received a message from my oldest sister that confirmed everything. "This is all because you won't talk," she wrote. "If you just explain, we could fix this." Fix this. I stared at the words for a long time. They didn't want truth. They wanted containment. I typed back a single sentence. "This isn't mine to fix." The reply never came. That was when I knew the family had crossed a threshold. There was no returning to the old balance, no reassembly of the roles as they had been. The system had begun to feed on itself, turning inward in search of stability it could no longer access. And I was finally free enough to let it. I sat quietly that night, listening to the absence of incoming messages, the rare stillness of not being needed to mediate anyone else's reality. The house felt calm, my mind felt clear. For the first time, the chaos wasn't mine to absorb. It belonged to them. And they were going to have to live with it. I didn't confront them all at once. That would have turned into noise, defensiveness, a collective performance where everyone fed off each other's reactions. I knew better than that. I had lived too long inside their dynamics to underestimate how quickly truth could be drowned out by volume. So I met them one by one. Quietly, deliberately, on my terms. The first was my brother. He asked to meet as if he were doing me a favor, suggesting coffee, neutral ground, public enough to keep things civil. I agreed, not because I needed safety, but because I wanted witnesses to restraint. He arrived late, irritation already radiating off him like heat. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't sit before speaking. "So," he said, arms crossed, "what's going on with you?" I studied his face for a moment, noticing details I'd always ignored before, the way impatience lived just under the surface, the expectation that this conversation would end with him satisfied. "I wanted to clear something up," I said calmly, "and then I'll leave." That caught his attention. I slid a single document across the table, not the whole stack, just one. His eyes flicked down, then back up. "What's this?" Read it, I said. He scoffed but picked it up anyway, skimming at first, then slowing. I watched his jaw tighten, the color draining from his face in increments. This doesn't mean what you think it means, he said finally. I know exactly what it means, I replied, and so do you. He leaned back, defensive now. Mom handled that. You always said you didn't care about this stuff. I nodded. I said I didn't need more than my share. I never said I didn't have one. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The document didn't give him room. Facts rarely do. This wasn't personal, he said. It was practical. For who? I asked. Silence. I stood, leaving him staring at the paper like it might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. I didn't wait for an apology. I didn't need one. The second conversation was with my younger sister. She cried before I said a word, which would have once undone me completely. This time, I waited. I let her cry without rushing to comfort her, without assuming responsibility for the feeling. I didn't know, she said. I swear I didn't. I believe you, I said. The relief on her face was immediate and telling. She hadn't needed forgiveness. She'd needed exoneration. But, I continued gently, you benefited anyway. She flinched, not in denial but recognition. I didn't ask for it, she whispered. No, I agreed, but you accepted it. We sat in that truth together, the quiet heavy but honest. When I left, she hugged me, tentative, unsure. I didn't hug back immediately, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Trust, I was learning, would be rebuilt slowly or not at all. The hardest meeting was my mother. I waited longer for that one, not because I was afraid, but because timing mattered. She needed to understand that this wasn't reactive. It was resolved. We met in her living room, the same one where so many half-truths had been spoken under the guise of warmth. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, and I noticed how quickly that stirred old instincts in me. I sat anyway. She began with tears, of course. I never meant to hurt you, she said. You have to know that. I know you didn't mean to, I replied, but you did. Her lips trembled. I was trying to keep the peace. At my expense, I said. She looked away. I placed the letter on the table between us, the one she had written years ago. The one she thought I would never read. She stared at it as if it were a ghost. You trusted me to survive the truth, I said quietly, but you never trusted me enough to choose. She reached for my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back. I didn't think you'd want to fight, she said. You were always different. I didn't want to fight, I said. I wanted fairness. The word landed hard. She tried then, explanations, justifications, fear. She talked about my siblings' needs, about fragility, about what she thought I could handle. She framed it as protection. I listened until she finished. Then I said, you used my strength as a resource. She closed her eyes. I needed someone I could trust, she whispered. And you trusted me with the burden, I replied, not the benefit. When I stood to leave, she asked the question I had expected all along. What do you want now? The old me would have softened, reassured, minimized. The new me answered honestly. I want you to understand that I won't protect this anymore, I said. Not for you, not for them. Her face crumpled, but I didn't stay to manage it. The final confrontation was with myself. That night alone, I sat with the echo of every conversation, every look, every shift in power. I resisted the urge to replay them endlessly, to critique my tone, my phrasing, my restraint. I had done enough of that for a lifetime. I realized then that confrontation wasn't about winning. It was about alignment, about speaking from a place that no longer required validation. I had said what needed to be said. And I had said it without apologizing for existing. As I turned out the light, one thought settled into me with surprising gentleness. The truth didn't destroy my family. It simply stopped protecting them from themselves. I waited a few days before touching the quilt again. Not because I was afraid of what it represented anymore, but because I wanted the moment to be deliberate. For most of my life, Things had happened to me quietly, without ceremony, without my consent. This time, I wanted intention. I wanted an ending that belonged to me. The quilt lay folded at the bottom of the guest room closet, exactly where I had placed it weeks earlier, when everything still felt raw and unstable. Now, the house was quiet in a different way. Not tense, not waiting, settled. I took it out and laid it across the bed, smoothing it with both hands. The fabric was familiar, the stitching uneven in the way handmade things often are. I could see my mother's hands in it clearly now, not as a symbol of love or sacrifice, but as evidence of effort shaped by fear. For years, I had believed this quilt represented care, time spent, attention given, a consolation prize meant to soften exclusion. Now I understood its real function. It had been a container, a way to hide what couldn't be spoken, a way to transfer responsibility without accountability, a way to give me something heavy enough to distract me from noticing what was missing. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my fingers along the seam I had opened, the place where the secret had finally surfaced. The stitches there were careful, reinforced, almost protective. She had made sure it wouldn't come undone easily. I wondered how many times she had checked that seam after finishing it, how often she had reassured herself that it would hold. I didn't feel anger as I thought about that. I felt clarity. My mother had made choices based on who she believed could endure the consequences. She had mistaken endurance for consent. She had believed that if I survived, the system was justified. That belief had shaped my life more than I realized. I stood and folded the quilt slowly, methodically, the way you fold something you are about to put away for good. Each fold felt like a release, not dramatic, not triumphant, just final. As I worked, memories surfaced uninvited. Family gatherings where the quilt was brought out and admired politely, its presence treated as quaint rather than valuable. Conversations where I was praised for my understanding, my lack of materialism, my ability to see the bigger picture. I saw those moments differently now. I had not been seeing the bigger picture. I had been positioned outside the frame. The last fold was the hardest, not because it hurt, but because it marked a transition I couldn't undo. Once folded this way, the quilt would never be what it had been to me. It would no longer sit across my shoulders like an identity I hadn't chosen. I placed it back in the closet, not hidden, not buried, just stored. It didn't need to dominate space anymore. Its story had been told. When I closed the door, I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if something I'd been carrying without noticing had finally been set down. In the days that followed, the fallout settled into a new normal. My siblings stopped calling as often. When they did reach out, their tone was careful, measured, stripped of entitlement. The urgency had faded, replaced by something closer to caution. They no longer assumed access. My mother called once more, a week later. I answered. We spoke quietly, without accusation, without defense. She didn't apologize in the way movies teach you to expect. She acknowledged instead that she had made choices based on fear. Fear of conflict, fear of collapse, fear of what would happen if everything was laid bare. I thought I was protecting the family, she said. You were protecting the structure, I replied, not the people. She was silent for a long moment. I don't know how to fix this, she said finally. I'm not asking you to, I answered. That, I think, was the moment she understood the shift. I was no longer waiting for repair. I was no longer positioning myself as the solution. We ended the call politely, almost gently. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't rupture. It was reality. And that was enough. I began rebuilding my life in small, practical ways. I revisited plans I had postponed, savings I had neglected, possibilities I had dismissed as unrealistic. I didn't rush. I didn't announce anything. I simply started choosing with myself in mind. That was new. I noticed how often I paused now before agreeing to things, how naturally I checked in with my own capacity. The reflex to overextend still surfaced sometimes, but it no longer controlled me. I could see it for what it was, a survival strategy that had outlived its usefulness. The emotional space that opened up was startling. Without constant vigilance, without managing everyone else's comfort, I had room to think, to feel, to imagine. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped around availability, around being the one who could handle it. Now, handling it was optional. One evening, weeks later, I took the quilt out again, just once. I spread it across the bed, not to relive anything, but to look at it honestly. It was well made, thoughtful, flawed. So was my mother. So was I. I folded it again, carefully, and placed it in a box this time, along with a letter and a single copy of the documents that had started everything. Not as evidence to wield, but as record, a reminder. I labeled the box simply, History. Then I put it away. The power of the quilt had never been in what it contained, I realized. It had been in what it taught me about silence, about endurance, about how easily love can be twisted into leverage when fear is allowed to lead. I had learned that being the strong one often means being the exploited one, unless strength is paired with boundaries. I had learned that fairness does not announce itself. It has to be insisted upon. Most importantly, I had learned that survival is not the same thing as living. The woman I was becoming did not absorb shock so others could remain comfortable. She did not confuse patience with virtue or silence with peace. She understood that love without equity is not love at all, it is management. That understanding changed everything. On the morning I finally donated my mother's old sewing basket, the one she no longer used, the one that had sat untouched for years, I felt no guilt, just closure. I kept the quilt, not because I owed anyone sentimentality, but because I had earned the right to decide what it meant to me. It was no longer a symbol of being chosen last. It was proof that even the things meant to minimize us can become instruments of awakening. I stood in my living room that afternoon, sunlight spilling across the floor, and felt something settle into place inside me. Not victory, not revenge, ownership. My life belonged to me now, fully and without apology. And if there was a moral to be drawn from all of this, it was simple, though not easy. Never confuse being trusted, to endure with being treated fairly. Never accept silence as love. And never let someone else's fear decide the shape of your life. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have kept the quilt folded neatly over your shoulders, carrying what you were never meant to carry? Or would you have opened the seam, faced the truth, and chosen yourself anyway? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the one expected to understand while others took, you're not alone. Stay with me. There are more stories like this, and sometimes hearing them is the first step toward reclaiming your own.